Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. It started as a simple question, a harmless thought that I shrugged off at first. Why does it always happen like this? I asked myself, watching this small, familiar object in my shopping basket. It wasn't something I put there. Yet, there it was, every single time. At first, I thought it was just a mistake, something I didn't notice, or maybe I was just distracted. But it happened again the next time I went to the store. And again the time after that. Something in my mind began to itch, a gnawing unease that I couldn't quite shake. The object wasn't large, nor particularly unusual, just a small, plastic bottle of olive oil. I don't even use olive oil regularly, so why would I keep ending up with it in my basket? I'd never consciously selected it. The first few times, I told myself I must be getting forgetful. It could have been my mind playing tricks on me, or maybe I had absent-mindedly grabbed it during one of those moments when I wasn't paying attention. But then I started paying attention. I made sure to check. I tried to be more careful, to track every item I picked up. Still, each time I reached the self-checkout, there it was. Olive oil. I'd never placed it there. The strange thing was, it didn't appear on the receipt. I checked the receipts meticulously. No olive oil listed. Only the things I actually bought. Bread. Milk. Eggs. But no olive oil. I could feel my pulse quicken the more I thought about it. Maybe I was overthinking it, but how could this be? Was I somehow subconsciously adding it to the basket? Or was something more strange happening? The oddity of it began to haunt me. Was I imagining things? On my next trip to the store, I was determined to figure it out once and for all. I walked slowly through the aisles, my eyes scanning the shelves, deliberately not reaching for anything I didn't need. My basket was light, almost empty, just the essentials, cereal, fruit, some canned goods. I moved with purpose, each item chosen carefully. I didn't even pass the oils section. Yet, when I got to the checkout, there it was. That same small plastic bottle of olive oil, sitting innocently among my groceries. I froze. I didn't pick it up. I didn't put it in my basket. But there it was, like it had been waiting for me. And just like before, the receipt listed nothing out of the ordinary. My heart began to race. The feeling in the pit of my stomach had changed now. It wasn't just confusion or curiosity, it was fear. I checked the security cameras when I got home. I'm not sure why I thought it might help. But I had to know. Was I losing my mind? Had I somehow, unknowingly, placed the bottle in my basket? Or was someone playing a cruel joke on me? I found the footage from the store. It was grainy, but it was clear enough. I watched myself, moving through the aisles, selecting items with methodical precision. I paused it right before the checkout. There was nothing. Nothing unusual. No olive oil in my basket. I even replayed the moment when I placed my groceries on the conveyor belt. The bottle was not there. And yet, when I scanned my items, the olive oil was sitting right there, like it had materialized out of nowhere. I felt my skin grow cold. I could hear my breath quickening on the video. It wasn't just my imagination. Something was happening. Something I couldn't explain. I pulled my phone out of my pocket and, in a haze of panic, began to search online. It was strange, everything I found seemed irrelevant, but somehow I kept digging. Pages on the supernatural, articles on strange occurrences, things that didn't quite make sense. There was one word that kept popping up in my search results. Residual. It was a term used for unusual phenomena that repeat themselves, often linked to a psychological or metaphysical anomaly. But none of the articles were helpful. In fact, they made me feel worse. As though I were chasing something bigger than I could comprehend. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard a sound. A soft, repetitive thud. It seemed to come from the kitchen. At first, I thought it was nothing. Maybe it was a piece of furniture settling. But the sound grew louder. It was like a soft tapping, almost a knock. I was frozen, staring at the ceiling, trying to tell myself that it was nothing. But the sound came again. Tap. 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 I could hear my heart pounding in my chest. Was it coming from inside the walls? The thought made my skin crawl. What was going on? I turned over and glanced at the clock, 3 a.m. too late for my mind to be playing tricks. Then, I thought I saw it. A shadow, just a flicker, moving across the hallway. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, maybe the wind causing the curtains to shift. But it wasn't. It was a figure, too tall, too thin, like it was stretching across the room, becoming something more. I couldn't move. The shadow moved again, slipping out of view. I lay there, afraid to breathe, but after a moment, the house fell silent again. In the morning, I checked the kitchen. There was nothing unusual. No olive oil. No sign of the shadow. Just the usual clutter, dishes, a few crumbs from last night's meal. But something had changed. It felt different now, as if the world had shifted just slightly out of place. And that's when I realized what was happening in the store was only part of it. There was something more. Something was following me. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't just the olive oil anymore. It was everything around me. My routine felt off, like I was living someone else's life. The oddest part was that I started noticing things I hadn't before. Little details. A flicker of movement in the corner of my vision, a soft whisper just beyond the edge of hearing. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, that I was just exhausted, but the unease grew stronger with each passing hour. I decided to go to the store again. I had to. I didn't know why, but the need to understand, to get to the bottom of this strange occurrence, had taken hold of me. It felt like an itch I couldn't scratch. As I walked through the familiar aisles, I kept my eyes fixed on my basket. I didn't want to look away for even a second. The last time, I hadn't seen the olive oil being placed there, but it had appeared. And now I couldn't trust my own eyes. I made my way through the store, carefully choosing my items, trying to keep my mind occupied. But the whole place felt wrong. The fluorescent lights buzzed louder than usual. The hum of the refrigeration units seemed to vibrate in my chest. I reached the checkout with my usual items: bread, milk, eggs, and a few cans of soup. I didn't even pass the oil section this time. I couldn't bring myself to. My eyes kept darting back to my basket. I felt paranoid, like something was watching me, but when I looked around, there was nothing. Just the usual shoppers, the indifferent cashier scanning items. But when my basket slid past the scanner, there it was again. The olive oil. I froze. This time, I was ready. I watched the checkout screen closely, but the bottle didn't show up on the receipt. I pulled the bottle out of the basket and held it in my hands, my fingers shaking. I didn't know what to do. I glanced around the store, my heart thudding in my chest. Was someone playing a joke on me? Was it a prank? But it wasn't. The atmosphere felt too heavy, too thick, like something unseen was pressing in on me, watching my every move. The cashier looked up at me, his face expressionless. He didn't seem to notice anything unusual. "Are you okay, sir?" he asked, as though I'd been standing there for far too long. I nodded, not trusting my voice. I quickly paid, took my groceries, and walked out of the store as fast as I could. When I got home, I sat down on the couch, staring at the olive oil bottle in my hands. I had no idea what to do with it. I hadn't bought it. It wasn't even on my receipt. But here it was, solid and real, in front of me. That night, the noises came again. This time, there was no mistaking it. The soft tapping had become more pronounced. A steady, rhythmic knock. It was coming from the kitchen. I had to get up. I had to see what was happening. My footsteps were slow, cautious. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the air around me had thickened, weighed down with something I couldn't name. When I reached the kitchen, I turned on the light. The room was exactly as I had left it. The dishes were still stacked in the sink. The counters were clear. Nothing was out of place, except the olive oil bottle. It was sitting in the center of the table. I didn't put it there. I hadn't touched it since I came home from the store. Yet there it was, placed carefully in the middle of the table, as if someone had set it down for me to see. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I couldn't breathe. A shadow flitted across the floor, something out of the corner of my eye. I spun around, heart racing, but there was nothing. Just the stillness of the kitchen. The tapping started again, but this time it wasn't coming from the table. It was coming from the walls. I backed away, my mind spinning. What was going on? What was happening to me? Then, as though answering my unspoken question, a voice echoed in my head. It was faint at first, like a whisper carried by the wind. But the more I listened, the clearer it became. "It's not just you." The words were cold, distant, and full of something I couldn't understand. But they were real. They were inside my head, clear as day. The air seemed to shift around me. The shadows in the room deepened, stretching toward me, as though the room itself was closing in. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt my pulse race. The walls seemed to bend, the edges of the room warping, as if they were not quite as solid as they should be. I couldn't look away from the olive oil bottle. It sat there on the table, still and silent, but it seemed to pulse with an energy I couldn't describe. I could almost feel it drawing me in, as if it was waiting for me to make the next move. Then, suddenly, the tapping stopped. The shadows receded. The room was normal again. But I wasn't. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out of place. I couldn't shake the voice. And I couldn't shake the thought that this was just the beginning. I glanced down at my hands. They were trembling, the olive oil bottle still clutched tightly between my fingers. I knew I couldn't ignore this anymore. Something was happening, and I had to figure out what it was before it was too late. I couldn't sleep that night. I sat on the couch, the olive oil bottle beside me, staring at it like it was a ticking clock. Something about it felt alive. I don't know how to explain it, but it was as if it was waiting, like it had been placed there with a purpose, like it knew I would be there, looking at it. I kept replaying what happened in the kitchen. The tapping, the shadows, the voice in my head. It felt like I was being pulled into something I couldn't control. It wasn't just a strange occurrence anymore, it was a presence. And it was growing. The worst part was that I couldn't talk to anyone about it. No one would believe me. I could already hear the dismissive comments, "You're just stressed. Maybe you need some sleep. It's all in your head." But it wasn't. It couldn't be. I grabbed my phone. I needed to find answers. I searched again, strange occurrences, residual energy, objects that shouldn't be there. The more I searched, the more I felt like I was getting closer to something I didn't want to understand. The words kept jumping out at me, interdimensional, echoes, haunting, time loops. The last search led me to an online forum, a dark corner of the internet where people talked about experiences just like mine. There were threads about strange objects showing up, about things being out of place in people's lives, about feeling like you're being watched by something you can't see. I read post after post. Each one sent a chill down my spine. There were people who had the same experience, things appearing in their homes, objects that didn't belong, things that felt like they didn't come from this world. Some mentioned hearing whispers. Some spoke of shadows, figures in the corner of their vision. Some even described voices in their heads, like I had heard. And the most unsettling part? They all said the same thing, it gets worse. They warned about the object. Once it started appearing, it wasn't just about that object anymore. The object was a gateway, something that was drawing them into something bigger. A presence. A force that would start following them, moving them towards something darker. I felt a knot tighten in my chest. I had to do something. I couldn't just sit there and wait for this thing to take over my life. The next day, I decided to confront it. I went back to the store. Not because I thought it would help, but because I had to know if I was the only one. Maybe there was something in the store that was causing this. Maybe it was all connected. When I arrived, I moved with purpose, my eyes darting around the aisles. I wasn't going to let myself be distracted this time. I walked past the olive oils, determined not to even glance at them. I grabbed my essentials, bread, milk, eggs, again, just like before. But when I reached the checkout, my heart dropped. There it was. The bottle of olive oil. I didn't even have to look at it. I could feel it. It was waiting for me. The cashier didn't seem to notice anything, but I could see it, sitting there, nestled among my other items, just like it always was. I didn't pick it up. I didn't want to. But it was there, right where I had placed it. I stood frozen, staring at it, as if waiting for something to happen. The air around me felt heavier. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. The cashier looked at me, a strange flicker of recognition in his eyes. "Is everything all right, sir?" he asked again. His voice was too calm, too detached. I nodded quickly, grabbed my bag, and rushed out of the store. My hands were shaking. The bottle was in my bag, and I felt like it was calling to me. It had power, and I was powerless to stop it. That night, I locked the bottle in a drawer. I tried to forget about it. I tried to sleep. But as the night wore on, I began to hear the tapping again. That rhythmic knock, like someone was tapping on the walls or maybe the floorboards. I sat up, my heart pounding, and I realized that the sound was growing louder. Closer. It was coming from inside the house. Not the walls. Not the kitchen. It was coming from the drawer. I couldn't believe it. I froze, staring at the closed drawer across the room. The tapping was unmistakable now. It was fast. It was almost like the bottle itself was trying to break free. I stood up slowly, my legs shaky beneath me. I had to see it. I had to know what was happening. I opened the drawer. The bottle of olive oil wasn't there. My breath caught in my throat. I scanned the room, my eyes wide in panic. Where had it gone? I moved quickly, turning the lights on, checking every corner. But there was no sign of it. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. The bottle was sitting on the table. Again. Just like before. But this time, something was different. There was a dark, oily smear around the base of the bottle. A trail, like something had been dragging it. I stepped forward, my body trembling. The shadows in the room shifted, twisting unnaturally. The air felt thick again, charged with static. I could hear the whispering again, faint but unmistakable. It's not just you. I closed my eyes, my hands shaking. The voice was clearer now. It wasn't in my head. It was real. Something was inside this house with me. And it wasn't going to stop. I turned to run, but before I could take another step, I felt something cold press against my back. I didn't dare turn around. But I knew, deep down, that I was no longer alone. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen. My entire body was numb, as though the air itself had solidified, turning everything around me into a prison I couldn't escape. The weight on my back, cold, suffocating, kept me rooted to the spot. I felt as though something was watching me, standing just behind me, breathing in time with my ragged breaths. I slowly turned my head, inch by inch, my heart hammering in my chest. But when I looked back, there was nothing there. Just the room, just the table, just the bottle of olive oil, now surrounded by a thin ring of dark liquid that seemed to pulse with an unnatural rhythm. But it wasn't just the bottle that was off. No. Something had changed in the room. The shadows, those twisted, unnatural shapes, had deepened. They weren't shadows anymore. They were moving, like fingers stretching across the floor, creeping along the walls, curling around the edges of my vision. I backed away slowly, my legs unsteady beneath me. I felt a pull on my chest, like something was trying to drag me toward the table, toward the bottle. I couldn't breathe. It was as if the air was thick with the scent of something rotten, sour, acrid, sharp. The smell of something decaying, spreading. Then the voice came again, clearer this time, more insistent. It wasn't in my head. It was in the room, pressing against my ears. You're part of it now. I gasped, stumbling backwards into the wall. My fingers scrabbled for the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. It was locked. Or was it? My mind was spinning. I turned, desperate, but the doorframe was distorting. The walls were bending, like the house itself was no longer solid, no longer real. The shadows were everywhere now, crawling across the walls, the floor, reaching for me. I could feel them tugging at my skin, at my clothes, their presence cold and clammy. I could hear them now, soft whispers, voices speaking in an unintelligible language, like 100 distant conversations happening all at once. It knows you. The words were a low, growling hiss, echoing in the back of my skull. My vision blurred, and I had to grab the edge of the table to steady myself. I looked down. The bottle was gone. For a moment, I stood there in confusion, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But when I glanced back at the table, it was there again, sitting perfectly still. No smear of oil. No sign that it had moved. My heart skipped a beat. This wasn't possible. I had seen it move. I had felt it move. But there it was again, as though it had never left. I could feel the cold breath on my neck again. I turned, this time slowly, until I was facing the door. I had to get out of the house. It was the only thought that kept me from losing myself entirely. I didn't know what was happening. I didn't know how, but the bottle, the voices, the shadows, they weren't just figments of my imagination. They were real. They were following me. I shoved at the door again, this time with all my strength. It gave way, creaking open just enough for me to slip through. I stumbled out into the hallway, gasping for air. The house felt alive, like it was closing in on me. The temperature dropped. The walls seemed to pulse with a low hum, vibrating under my skin. The hallway stretched longer than it should have. The door at the end was too far away. The house was changing. I could hear footsteps behind me, soft, slow, methodical, like something following me, stalking me. I didn't turn around. I broke into a run. My feet slapped against the hardwood floor, but every step felt like it was taking me further from safety. The shadows in the corners of the hallway seemed to bend and stretch, moving toward me, their whispers growing louder. You can't escape. The voice, no longer a whisper, came from the walls themselves, the floor, the ceiling. Everywhere. It was inside my head, inside my body. The house was alive. And it knew me. It wanted me. I made it to the front door, hands shaking as I fumbled for the knob. It was stuck. The lock wouldn't turn. I heard a sound behind me. A low growl, followed by a shuffling. My heart skipped in my chest. I spun around. There it was. The figure. It was a shadow, but not just any shadow. It was tall, too tall. Its form was indistinct, like it was made of darkness itself, but there were features. Eyes, dark, hollow pits. A mouth that didn't move, but I could see it there, grinning, wide and full of something that wasn't human. It took a step toward me, and the shadows around it stretched and slithered, wrapping around its form like a cloak. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. It was there, standing in front of me. And behind it, the shadows grew thicker, swallowing the room. The voice came again, now in perfect unison with the figure's movement. It's too late. You are part of the cycle now. The shadows closed in. The room, the house, the world, everything was drowning in darkness. I could feel the weight of it pressing on me, dragging me down into the void. And then, nothing. The world was quiet. Silent. I opened my eyes. I was standing in the kitchen. The table was in front of me, and the bottle of olive oil was sitting in the exact same spot, like it had never moved. I stared at it, unable to process what had just happened. My mind was a mess. I couldn't think. Couldn't remember. But then, I noticed something. The shadows were still there. They were in the corners of the room, gathering, waiting. And in their midst, I saw it again. The figure. Standing, watching. And the voice, now more distant, echoed in my mind one last time. It will always be here. I closed my eyes, my hands trembling. The bottle sat before me, still and silent. But I knew it had never really left. The cycle was starting again. And this time, I wasn't sure if I'd be able to escape. I woke up to the sound of my own breath, harsh and ragged, like I had been holding it for far too long. My body felt strange, heavy, disconnected. I blinked rapidly, trying to make sense of the room around me. The kitchen, the table, the bottle of olive oil right where it had always been. But everything felt off. It wasn't just the shadows, those shifting shapes that seemed to be watching from the corners of my vision. It was the air itself. It was thick with something I couldn't name. Like the world had become too real. Too tangible, and yet somehow distant, as though I were standing on the edge of a cliff, ready to fall into an abyss. I stood up slowly, my legs unsteady, my heart pounding in my chest. The house was eerily quiet. No sounds from outside. No cars. No birds. Just silence. And then, that tap. 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 It was faint at first, but unmistakable. The sound seemed to come from the walls, or from within the house, vibrating through the floorboards like it was alive. I couldn't breathe. I turned toward the sound. And there, in the hallway, I saw it. A figure. A shadow. It stood motionless, watching me. I could feel its gaze even from a distance, the weight of it pressing against my skin. It wasn't just a shadow, it was more than that. It was a presence. The tapping stopped, and for a moment, everything was still. And then, the voice came again. It's time. It wasn't in my head this time. The voice was outside me, around me, in the air itself. I could feel it, inside the walls, inside the space between the beats of my heart. It knew me. It knew everything about me. It knew my fears, my doubts, my weaknesses. I tried to move, tried to run, but my body was paralyzed, frozen in place. It felt like the house had become a prison, the walls closing in around me. The shadows grew longer, reaching for me with their dark, liquid tendrils. I could see the figure now, stepping slowly toward me. Its movements were unnatural, too fluid, too quick, like it was made of darkness itself. It didn't walk. It floated, gliding across the floor with a predatory grace. Its eyes were black holes, deep and endless, and as it drew closer, I could see its mouth, wide and grotesque, filled with rows of sharp, jagged teeth. You can't escape it, the voice whispered, and I felt the cold breath of it wash over me. I staggered backward, my mind racing. What was this? Was I dreaming? Was I losing my mind? I glanced around, looking for an escape, but the door was still locked. The windows sealed shut. The house had become a maze, twisting and contorting on itself. Every corner, every hallway seemed to stretch further away from me. There was no way out. I tried to scream, but my voice was lost. The figure reached out, its long, spindly fingers grazing the air between us. It was so close now. Its presence was suffocating, and I could feel its cold touch on my skin, like the chill of death itself. You belong to it now. The words were a low growl, vibrating through the floor beneath me. I fell to my knees, unable to move, unable to think. The figure towered over me, casting an unnatural shadow that consumed everything in its path. And then, the bottle. The olive oil bottle. It was there, on the table, gleaming in the faint light of the room. I didn't know how I knew, but I understood in that moment. The bottle wasn't just an object. It was the key. It was the anchor to whatever this thing was. The reason I couldn't escape. The reason the house was changing. The reason the shadows were here. The bottle had brought it here. It had brought all of this. The shadows closed in, and I could feel their cold, clammy fingers wrapping around my throat. The figure leaned closer, its lips curling into a twisted grin. I could hear its breath, ragged and hollow, as it whispered one final time. It will always be here. I reached out with trembling fingers, and somehow, I was standing again. The house was spinning around me, the walls warping, and the shadows were pressing in, suffocating, choking me. My fingers closed around the bottle, and for the first time, I felt a pulse of energy, dark, suffocating, alive, surge through my body. And then the room went black. I don't know how long I was gone. It could have been seconds. It could have been days. Time seemed to lose all meaning. When I opened my eyes again, the house was still there. The kitchen, the table, the olive oil bottle sitting innocently in its place. But something had changed. The shadows were gone. The air was still. The tapping had stopped. The voice gone. I took a deep breath. The house felt empty now, like the presence had faded away, like it had never been there at all. I felt like I had just woken from a nightmare, but something inside me knew better. The bottle was still in my hands, and I could still feel it, pulsing with that dark, sickly energy. It hadn't gone away. It had just waited. I turned, my heart pounding, and for a moment, I thought I saw it again. The figure. Just a flicker in the corner of my vision, too quick to catch. But it was enough to make me understand. It wasn't over. It would never be over. I walked toward the door, my mind racing. There had to be a way out. There had to be a way to break the cycle. But as I stepped into the hallway, I heard it. The faintest of taps. Tap. 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 And I knew. It was already starting again. Have you ever had something happen to you that you couldn't explain? Something that didn't make sense no matter how hard you tried to figure it out? Something small, almost trivial, but it keeps nagging at the back of your mind, like a splinter you can't quite remove. That's how it started for me, the feeling that something was off. It wasn't big. Not at first. Just a little thing. But those little things always have a way of growing into something bigger. It started with a ticket. A movie ticket, to be exact. I had been cleaning out my purse when I found it. It was tucked at the bottom, wedged between some crumpled receipts and an old shopping list. I didn't think much of it at first. But when I pulled it out, I froze. The date on the ticket was from earlier that afternoon, a few hours ago, and the movie had already started. That wasn't the weird part. The weird part was that I hadn't bought the ticket. I hadn't even planned on going to the movies. I turned the ticket over in my hands, my fingers brushing over the glossy paper. The name printed on it, my name, was clear and crisp. I could feel my heartbeat quicken as I studied it more closely. Why would I have a ticket to a movie I didn't remember buying? It was a strange feeling, a mix of confusion and unease. I hadn't bought a ticket. I hadn't even been to the cinema today. I had spent the afternoon at home, cleaning, maybe scrolling through my phone for a while, but nothing out of the ordinary. Yet, there it was, a ticket with my name on it, for a movie I couldn't recall. The time was already long past when it had started, so there was no way I could even go if I wanted to. I tried to shake it off, told myself it was just one of those little things that didn't matter. Maybe I had bought it earlier in the week and forgotten. Maybe I had just dropped it in my bag by accident. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The longer I held that ticket, the more unsettled I became. The air in my apartment suddenly felt too thick, like it was pressing in on me, wrapping around me. I walked over to the window, hoping the fresh air would help clear my head. But when I looked out, everything seemed different. The street below was quieter than usual, the cars moving more slowly, the people walking as though they were in a daze. I shook my head, telling myself it was nothing. I had been too focused on the ticket, and now I was letting my imagination get the best of me. But as I turned back toward the kitchen, my phone buzzed. I glanced at the screen. It was a message from an unknown number. "Did you enjoy the movie?" I stared at the text for a long moment, my heart pounding in my chest. My fingers hovered over the screen. How did they know about the ticket? I hadn't told anyone about it. I hadn't even told myself. I had only just found the damn thing. I felt a chill run down my spine. I didn't reply. Instead, I set the phone down, my hands trembling slightly. I had to get out of my head, clear away the fog. But every time I looked at that ticket, I couldn't help but feel that the answer to some kind of question was just out of reach. I glanced at the clock. The movie had started hours ago. There was no way I could be late to something I never attended. But as the evening wore on, I couldn't stop thinking about the ticket. It weighed on me, pressing down on my thoughts like a heavy stone. And when I went to bed that night, the shadows seemed deeper, the silence more oppressive. I could hear a faint buzzing in my ears, like the distant hum of a projector light. It was so subtle, I couldn't be sure if it was real, or if it was just the sound of my mind playing tricks on me. But as I closed my eyes, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had missed something. Something important. Something I couldn't remember. The next morning, the feeling was still there. That quiet, persistent unease. I tried to go about my day as usual, but nothing felt the same. The ticket still sat on the kitchen counter, waiting for me to make sense of it. I had to know more. So I decided to go to the cinema. Maybe, if I went there, I would figure out what was happening. Maybe I'd find someone who could tell me what was going on. I grabbed my coat, feeling the weight of the ticket in my pocket as I left my apartment. The streets were bustling with life, but the noise felt muffled, like I was walking underwater. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, but every time I looked around, I saw nothing unusual. When I reached the cinema, I hesitated outside for a moment. The sign above the doors flickered erratically, casting strange shadows on the pavement. There were no lines, no crowds, just a few people milling about. I pushed open the door, the cool air from inside washing over me. The lobby was quiet, too quiet. A couple of people stood in line at the concession stand, but there was something about their movements that didn't sit right. It was like they were waiting for something. Like they were waiting for me. I walked up to the counter, my heart pounding. I couldn't explain why, but I felt like something was about to happen, something I wasn't ready for. The attendant, a young man with a bored expression, glanced up at me. "Hi," I said, my voice sounding strange even to my own ears. "I found this ticket for the movie. It's for today's showing." I handed him the ticket. He took it without a word, scanning it through the machine. Then, he looked at me with an expression that sent a shiver down my spine. "You were here already," he said. "Earlier today." I blinked, my throat tightening. "What do you mean?" "I haven't been here today. I didn't even buy the ticket." He shrugged, handing the ticket back to me. "Maybe you're remembering wrong. Happens all the time." But I could see it now. His eyes. The way they seemed to flicker with something behind them. Something off. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the ticket in my hand. It didn't make sense. None of it did. But something about this place, this moment, felt wrong. It was as though the walls were closing in on me. Something I couldn't see was waiting, just out of reach. And suddenly, I felt a whisper of something I hadn't felt before. I wasn't supposed to be here. And whatever had given me that ticket was waiting for me to figure it out. The air in the cinema lobby felt too still, too thick. I could hear the faint hum of the overhead lights, the muffled voices of the few patrons scattered around, but it all seemed distant. The words of the attendant still echoed in my mind. "You were here already." How could that be? How could I have been here earlier today, when I was so certain that I hadn't? My fingers tightened around the ticket in my hand as I glanced over it again. The date, the time, everything was correct. But I wasn't. I wasn't the person on the ticket. I hadn't bought it. So, what did this mean? Was this a mistake? A simple coincidence? Or was it something more? I turned slowly, my mind spinning. The lobby was still quiet, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I glanced over at the movie poster on the wall, tonight's feature, the final act. It didn't seem familiar. But the title, something about it felt wrong. Almost like I had heard it before. Without thinking, I walked toward the hallway leading to the theaters. The lights overhead flickered once, then twice. A soft buzzing noise followed. I hesitated, the feeling of unease crawling up my spine. I looked back at the counter where the attendant still stood, watching me with that same strange, unreadable expression. "Are you sure you're all right?" he had asked when I handed him the ticket, as though he knew something I didn't. I ignored him and kept walking, my steps quickening as I reached the door to the theater. The one for my ticket. I didn't know why, but it felt like the only thing I could do. Maybe if I sat through the movie, whatever this was would make sense. Maybe if I saw what had happened, I could remember. I pushed the door open. The theater was dimly lit, the air inside heavy with the scent of popcorn and something else, something metallic, almost like blood. A few people were scattered across the rows, sitting in silence. Their heads tilted forward, their faces illuminated by the flickering screen. The movie had already started, but no one seemed to care. They were all still, unmoving. No rustling of popcorn, no whispers, no fidgeting. Just complete silence, except for the low hum of the projector. The lights in the theater were off, and the screen cast an eerie glow over everything. I squinted, trying to make sense of what was playing. The film on the screen seemed oddly familiar, yet completely alien. The scene that unfolded was of a woman walking down a dark hallway. I couldn't see her face clearly, but her movements were unnervingly deliberate, like she was heading towards something or someone. I took a few steps into the theater, and that's when I noticed it. The seats closest to the screen were empty, except for one. The woman's seat. The very seat I had taken earlier. I froze. There, on the seat, was an object. It was small, but unmistakable. A crumpled ticket. I stumbled forward, my heart racing. The seat felt wrong, like it had been waiting for me to sit in it. The ticket, crumpled and discarded, looked strangely familiar. I reached down, pulling it out from the folds of the fabric. It was another ticket. For the same movie. For today's showing. But this time, there was something different. It wasn't my name on the ticket. It was a different name. A name I didn't recognize. I turned back toward the screen, my stomach twisting. The woman in the film was walking closer now, moving through the dark hallway with that same deliberate pace. And as she neared the end of the hallway, she turned. Her face was still hidden in the shadows, but I could feel her presence. Her eyes. It was like she was staring directly at me. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I couldn't look away. The movie flickered, the screen distorting for a brief second. When it cleared, the scene had changed. It was the hallway from the cinema. The very one I had just walked down. I was in the movie. The screen showed me walking down the same hallway I had just traversed, my steps in sync with the character on screen. My heartbeat quickened, and I could feel the cold sweat gathering on the back of my neck. The woman in the movie, the one who looked like me, stopped in front of the door to the theater. She was waiting for me. I stumbled backward, knocking into one of the empty seats. My breath was shallow, panicked. I turned and ran for the exit, but the door wouldn't open. The handle wouldn't budge. I slammed my palm against the cold metal, feeling the panic rising in my chest. The movie was still playing, still showing me in the hallway. Still showing me walk into the same theater, sit in the same seat. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with my phone, trying to call someone, anyone, but the screen was frozen. The buzzing from the projector seemed to grow louder. The hum filled the room, vibrating through my chest. And then, the door behind me creaked. I turned, slowly, almost afraid to look. But there, standing in the doorway, was the woman from the film. She was tall, thin, with dark hair that fell in waves around her face. Her eyes were hollow, black pits that seemed to swallow all light. Her lips were pulled back in a cold, eerie smile. "You're here," she whispered, her voice like the scrape of nails on glass. "You've always been here." I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I reached for the door again, but it was no use. It was as though the theater itself was alive, breathing, shifting around me. The walls closed in, pressing against my chest. I could feel the coldness of the air, the weight of her presence, suffocating me. I backed away, my heart pounding in my ears. But the woman didn't move. She just stood there, watching me, as if waiting for something. Waiting for me to realize something. And that's when it hit me. This was never just a movie. This was my life. Everything, the ticket, the movie, the strange feeling, the shadowy woman, had been leading to this moment. I was the one trapped in the story. I had always been the one in the seat, waiting to see what happened next. But the problem was, I wasn't the one who was supposed to be in control. I had never been in control. The ticket, the woman, the movie, it was all part of a cycle. A loop I could never escape. I glanced back at the screen, and there it was again, my own face, watching me. I was trapped, and it was too late to turn back. The woman in the doorway didn't move. Her eyes, hollow and black, fixed on me with an intensity that felt suffocating. I couldn't breathe. My chest felt tight, as though the very air had become too thick to draw in. The world around me seemed to blur and twist, the movie's flickering light warping the edges of reality, making everything feel surreal. I stumbled back, desperate to escape, but my feet refused to move. "You can't leave," the woman whispered again, her voice barely audible over the buzzing of the projector. It was soft, like a promise or a threat. I wanted to scream, to run, but all I could do was stand there, frozen, trapped between the screen and the door, with nowhere to go. "This is where it begins," she said, her voice distant now, like an echo from another time. "It has to begin here." Her words echoed in my mind, over and over, like a chant that didn't make sense, but somehow resonated deep inside of me. The film was still playing, and the scene on the screen, my scene, was growing more distorted, more fragmented. The hallway in the film, the same one I had walked through moments ago, was starting to crumble, the walls cracking and shifting, like the entire cinema was falling apart. I turned back to the door. It was still locked. Still sealed. I tried again, shaking the handle, pulling at it with all my strength, but it wouldn't budge. There was no way out. I was trapped. And somehow, deep down, I knew it wasn't just this theater I was locked in. It was everything. I turned, and the woman was gone. Just like that, vanished into thin air. But I could still feel her presence. Her eyes were still on me. I could sense her in every shadow, in every flicker of the projector's light. I ran. I didn't know where I was going or why, but I couldn't stay there. My feet carried me down the aisle, and I saw the exit door at the back of the theater, just a few steps away. I reached it and yanked it open with a force that almost pulled me off my feet. But when I stepped into the hallway, I froze again. It wasn't the hallway I had just walked down. It was different. It was the same hallway, but wrong. The walls were crumbling, as though the space itself was decaying, warping, as if it was being eaten away by something unseen. The floor beneath my feet was soft, almost spongy, and the air was thick with a suffocating humidity. There was no sound now, except for the faint whir of the projector, still playing somewhere in the distance. I didn't know where to go, where to run. But I knew one thing, I had to keep moving. Whatever was happening, whatever she was, it wasn't something I could fight. I had to escape it, outsmart it, even if I didn't understand it. I turned a corner and found another door, this one half open. I pushed through it and into a small, dimly lit room. It looked like a storage area, empty shelves lined the walls, and the air smelled of dust and mildew. I felt the door close behind me, and I whipped around to see if anything was following. But there was nothing. Just the silence. I stepped back into the room, my hands trembling. "You can't escape," the voice whispered again. It wasn't from the woman anymore. It was everywhere. In the air, in the walls, inside my head. "You're part of the story now." The walls began to close in, the space around me shrinking, contracting, like the very fabric of the room was folding in on itself. I felt a sense of vertigo, as though the ground beneath me was giving way. My breath was shallow now, my pulse racing as the darkness around me deepened. I had to leave. I had to escape. I couldn't stay in this room, in this place, for another second. I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the soft, spongy floor. The hallway stretched before me, an endless corridor that seemed to twist and bend in impossible directions. There was no end to it. No escape. And then, I heard it. The tapping. At first, it was faint, just a rhythmic sound in the distance. But it was growing louder, closer, like someone's footsteps following mine. I didn't want to turn around. I didn't want to look. But I had to. I couldn't help myself. I slowed to a stop, turning on my heels. The hallway was still empty, just a long stretch of decaying walls and flickering lights. But then, at the far end, I saw her again. The woman. She was standing still, her figure outlined in the pale, flickering light. Her black eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment, the world around me seemed to stop. The buzzing of the projector faded, and the air became still. Silent. "I've been waiting for you," she whispered, her voice a low, almost affectionate sound. "Now, it's time for you to remember." Before I could respond, before I could move, the lights above me flickered one last time. The entire hallway plunged into darkness. In that silence, something shifted. A soft, almost imperceptible sound. The sound of a door creaking open, just behind me. I turned quickly, my heart pounding in my chest. The door was ajar, leading into a room I hadn't seen before. But it wasn't just a room. It was the theater. The same theater. The one I had come from. I was standing in front of the door I had just escaped from. The very door. The same one I had opened to leave. But now, it had led me back here. It was like the door had circled around itself, trapping me in some infinite loop, forcing me back to the same place. I looked around, trying to understand, but the walls were no longer solid. They rippled like liquid, shifting between the familiar and the unknown. The flickering lights turned into distorted, nauseating flashes that made my vision spin. "You will watch," the woman said, her voice now louder, like it was coming from all directions. "You will always watch." I didn't understand what she meant. Why was she doing this? Why was I here? Why was I stuck in this story? And then, the screen turned to static. The image of the hallway, the image of me, dissolved into a mass of white noise, swirling around the edges of my vision like a storm. And in that moment, I realized the truth. I wasn't just watching the movie. I was the movie. Everything that had happened, every strange event, every inexplicable moment, had been leading me here. I had no choice but to play my part. To watch. To wait for it to end. But I knew, deep down, it would never end. Not for me. Not for anyone. I was trapped in a cycle, repeating the same scene over and over, watching myself again and again, unable to escape. And no matter how hard I tried, I would always return to the beginning. To the ticket. To the woman. The static on the screen was louder now, crackling, screeching in my ears. My head pounded with the noise, but I couldn't look away. The hallway in the movie was gone, replaced by a swirling mass of white and black, jagged lines cutting through the air. And then, silence. The screen went black. In that moment, the buzzing stopped. The lights in the theater flickered back on, the harsh fluorescent glow filling the room with a sudden, overwhelming brightness. I blinked, disoriented, my eyes struggling to adjust. I wasn't sure if the sudden light was comforting or terrifying. But what terrified me more was the silence that followed. No hum of the projector. No sound of the audience. Nothing. I took a shaky breath, heart racing, and glanced around. The seats were empty now. The rows that had once been filled with still figures were completely deserted. The air was thick, with an oppressive stillness, like the whole world had paused, waiting for something, waiting for me. And then I heard it. A whisper. So faint I almost thought I imagined it. You know what happens next. It came from behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing, just the same empty rows, the same quiet theater. My pulse quickened. I tried to rationalize it, to make sense of it, but my mind was scrambling, trying to hold on to anything that made sense. You were always meant to be here. The voice was closer now, behind me, in the shadows. It was no longer a whisper, but a breath, cold, unnatural. I turned slowly, my body trembling as I faced the back of the theater. The door at the far end was wide open, the light from the hallway spilling in, casting long, distorted shadows across the floor. I couldn't breathe. My chest was tight, like I was suffocating in this suffocating silence. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, to get out. But the door wasn't real. I had gone through that door already. It had led me back. It had led me nowhere. You think you can leave? I turned toward the voice, my heart pounding in my ears. There, standing at the edge of the aisle, was the woman. Her long hair hung in dark, tangled strands around her face, her eyes still empty voids of blackness. She was watching me, as if waiting for something, and I was drawn to her, compelled, like a moth to a flame. I was waiting for you to remember. Her words were like a command. But I didn't want to remember. I didn't want to know why I was here, why this place felt so wrong. I just wanted to escape. But her presence, it held me in place. I couldn't look away. The static from the projector seemed to hum in the background again, filling the theater with a low, insistent pulse, as though it was syncing with the beat of my heart. You are the movie. Her voice was like a cold breeze, piercing through me. You always have been. I couldn't process what she meant. My brain refused to make the connections, but the words clung to me, scratching at the edges of my mind. The more I tried to push them away, the more they gnawed at me. The tickets, the movie, the seats, it's all part of it. You're part of it. This story has been waiting for you. I stepped back, but my legs were weak, unsteady. The floor beneath me seemed to move, like the tiles were shifting, rearranging themselves. The aisles stretched longer, the walls expanding and contracting, like the room was breathing, alive. I looked at the woman. Her smile twisted, something predatory in the way her lips pulled back, revealing a row of teeth too sharp, too white. She stepped forward, her bare feet making no sound against the floor, gliding toward me like she wasn't even touching the ground. You're the audience. Her voice slithered into my mind, surrounding me. But you're also the star. You're the story. I backed away, my mind struggling to comprehend, to make sense of this nightmare. The static on the screen had returned, now louder, blurring everything around me. I felt my grip on reality slipping, everything becoming distant and warped. The woman's image flickered, distorting like a bad signal on a TV, fading in and out of focus. I didn't buy the ticket, I whispered, my voice hoarse. I didn't choose this. The woman's grin widened. It doesn't matter. Her voice echoed, now merging with the static on the screen. You are here now, and you'll never leave. I shook my head, desperate to wake up, to escape whatever this was. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening. The theater, this place, it wasn't real. It was just wrong. Everything was wrong. And then everything stopped. The static, the hum, the air around me, it all vanished in an instant. The lights flickered out, and I was plunged into total darkness. But it wasn't silent anymore. No. I could hear it. A soft tapping, faint but deliberate, echoing in the stillness. It came from the screen. I turned toward it. The screen was back. It was no longer static. The blackness cleared, revealing the very same scene that had started this whole nightmare. A woman walking down a dark hallway toward the door of the theater. But it wasn't just the movie. It was me. I was on the screen again, walking down that hallway. The same one I had walked through before. The same steps, the same uncertainty. Only this time, I wasn't alone. There was someone with me. In the corner of the screen, a shadowy figure appeared, stepping silently behind me. At first, I thought it was just a glitch. But no, this was real. I could see the figure moving, slowly, deliberately, like it was following me. It was the woman. She was in the movie now. I turned away from the screen, my body freezing with terror. The shadow on the screen was no longer a shadow. It was stepping out of the frame. I was inside the movie now. The woman was in the aisle with me. I could feel her presence, her cold eyes on my back. I turned and ran. I had to run. There was no way out, no way to escape this nightmare. The door behind me was no longer a door. The hallway wasn't a hallway. The seats weren't seats. They were all parts of the story now. And the story was never going to end. Not until it had me. The last thing I heard before the world went black was the woman's voice, soft and chilling. You're not the one who gets to choose. And then everything stopped. But I never woke up. The silence was suffocating. No sound. No light. No movement. It felt like being submerged in thick, inescapable darkness. I couldn't tell if I was still in the theater, in that twisting hallway, or somewhere far beyond the reach of any reality I knew. I tried to move, but my body wouldn't respond. I felt, waited, like I was chained to the very air around me. The stillness pressed against me, cold and suffocating, as if I had become part of it. My mind raced, my thoughts splintering, each one a shard of panic. Was this death? Was this what happened to people who were lost in places like this? Was I doomed to become part of this story? And then, a light. It was small at first, flickering like a dying star in the far distance. It grew, slowly, painfully, until it expanded enough to fill the space around me. I blinked, but my eyes couldn't adjust fast enough. The light burned. It was too bright. I tried to shield my face, but it didn't help. The light seemed to pulse, drawing me closer, pulling me toward it. I took a hesitant step forward. My legs felt like they were moving of their own accord, as though the air itself was pushing me toward it. The light grew stronger, and I saw it now, not just the light, but the screen. The same screen. The same hallway. And I was there again, standing in front of the door, just like the first time. My hand reached out, but I didn't want to touch it. I didn't want to open it. But I couldn't stop myself. The door swung open. On the other side was the theater. The same one. The rows of empty seats. The projector buzzing, its cold hum filling the space with its mechanical rhythm. And in front of me, on the screen, I saw myself again. Me. Walking down the hallway. The same hallway I had been trapped in so many times before. I couldn't look away. Something inside me screamed. No. Not again. Not this time. But the sight of it, it felt familiar. Too familiar. I wanted to turn back, to escape. But no matter how much I wanted to run, my feet remained rooted to the spot. You're here, the woman's voice whispered again. But it wasn't coming from behind me this time. It was coming from the screen. The words seemed to ripple through the air, reverberating in my skull, louder, clearer than ever. The hallway on the screen wasn't just a hallway anymore. The walls were now solid figures, moving toward me. The ceiling lowered, coming down to crush me. The floor buckled and warped like it was alive, dragging me deeper into its twisted folds. I was the movie now. I could feel the film itself inside me, crawling through my skin, twisting my bones into its dark, inescapable plot. The characters, the story, the woman, they all belonged to this place. They weren't just in the movie. They were the movie. And I was the audience. You can't leave. You're part of it now. The woman's voice was everywhere, surrounding me. I could feel her behind me, beside me, above me, her cold breath against my ear. The static on the screen was deafening now, each crackle and pop like 1,000 voices speaking at once, the images on the screen distorting and flickering in a maddening frenzy. I stumbled back, my feet unsteady, my heart pounding. The image on the screen shifted again. This time, I saw the hallway. But I wasn't just watching it. I was in it. Walking. Each step I took echoed in the air like a drumbeat. And then I saw her again. The woman. She stood at the end of the hallway, watching me. Her dark eyes locked onto mine, cold, unblinking. She didn't move. Didn't speak. She just waited. Come to me, she whispered. Come and see what you are. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But I couldn't move. My body wouldn't respond. I was stuck. Trapped in this endless loop of repetition. Over and over. The same scene, the same hallway, the same woman. I realized, with a terrible, sinking clarity, that I wasn't supposed to escape. I wasn't supposed to break free. I was part of this. Part of the story. The movie was me. And I was the movie. I reached the end of the hallway, slowly, as if pulled by invisible strings. The door in front of me swung open, just as it had every time before. But this time, I didn't see the theater on the other side. No. This time, there was nothing. Just darkness. I stepped through it, not knowing what awaited me on the other side. The woman's laughter echoed behind me, filling the void. A sound that felt both comforting and suffocating, like a lullaby sung by a ghost. I stepped forward, and the screen went black. The end? Or perhaps, just the beginning. Have you ever written something, only to look back at it and realize that one crucial part is missing? Something important that you should remember, but somehow don't? And then it starts to feel as if you didn't just forget, but something else, something deeper, was at play? I didn't think much of it at first. It seemed like a minor oversight. But that's how it always begins, doesn't it? With something small, something so easily dismissed. I'm a writer. I spend my days surrounded by words, my fingers constantly dancing over the keyboard, shaping thoughts into sentences, paragraphs, chapters. It's a life of solitude, but I never minded that. In fact, I thrived on it. My thoughts and my work were my companions. But lately, I've been feeling strange. Like I'm not the one writing anymore. Like the words are coming from somewhere else. It was late one evening when it first happened. I was going through the manuscript for my new novel, reading over what I'd written earlier that day. I came across a passage, one that I thought was finished, until I realized something was wrong. A whole paragraph was there, but there was a word missing. The sentence didn't make sense. I read it again and again, trying to figure out what it was supposed to say. But the word wasn't there. I didn't remember ever removing it. I hadn't deleted it or changed it, it was just gone. It was a small thing, really. Just one word. But the more I looked at the page, the more unsettling it became. The absence seemed louder than the words on the page, as if the empty space had taken on life of its own. I tried to remember what the word had been. I thought about it for hours, but it wouldn't come. The gap was maddening, like a piece of a puzzle that refused to fit. The next morning, I didn't think about it again. I figured it was just a momentary lapse in focus, something my tired brain had missed. I had work to do. A deadline was looming, and I couldn't afford to get caught up in small details. But then it happened again. I was reviewing the manuscript a few days later when I found another missing word. This time, it wasn't a single gap in a sentence. It was an entire phrase. A sentence, gone, as if it had never been there at all. I checked the version history of the file, thinking maybe I had accidentally deleted it during editing, but no. It was there the last time I worked on it. The word was just gone. Now, I started to feel uneasy. I've been writing for years. I know how to keep track of my work. I'm meticulous about revisions and versions. This wasn't something I could explain away. It wasn't just forgetfulness. I didn't delete the word, and yet it wasn't there. I decided to take a break from my manuscript. Maybe I needed a clear head. But when I stepped outside, something odd caught my eye. I was walking down the street to grab a cup of coffee when I saw a billboard. It was a simple ad for a new coffee shop opening nearby, but the word on it, it was the word that had been missing from my manuscript. I stopped. I couldn't breathe for a moment. There it was, clear as day, sitting right in front of me. The very word I had been unable to remember. How could this be? The word wasn't something common. It wasn't something I had seen recently or thought about. It was completely random. And yet, there it was. As if I had somehow seen it before I even knew it was missing. My heart raced. I looked around, as if expecting someone to step out from the shadows, explaining it all. But no one did. The streets were busy, people going about their day, none of them noticing the strange synchronicity that had just occurred. I tried to shake it off, tell myself it was just a coincidence. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. Something was wrong. The word, the gap in my writing, the advertisement, I couldn't escape the feeling that it was all connected. But how? And why? I didn't know. I only knew that I couldn't ignore it anymore. I turned and walked toward the coffee shop, trying to push the strange thought from my mind. But my pace quickened as I passed the billboard again, and I couldn't stop myself from glancing at it one more time. The word was still there. But this time, I didn't feel reassured. Instead, I felt the unmistakable sensation of being watched. I didn't go into the coffee shop that day. I didn't even buy the coffee. My legs were heavy, my thoughts a blur. I kept walking, each step seeming to echo louder in my mind than the last. I couldn't shake the image of that billboard, the words still floating in my head, like it was trying to pull me somewhere, to tell me something I wasn't ready to understand. When I got home, I sat down at my desk, staring at the blank page of my manuscript. The word, now etched into my mind, wouldn't leave. It was a simple word, nothing special on its own, but somehow, in the context of my story, it had been everything. And now it felt like it was haunting me. I picked up my pen and tried to continue, to write past it, to fill the gaps. But every time my hand hovered over the page, I found myself unable to form the next sentence. My mind was racing, caught in a loop of what-ifs. I couldn't stop thinking about how the word had appeared on that billboard, how it had stared at me in the crowded street. Had I seen it somewhere else before? Was it always there, hiding in plain sight? The ticking of the clock on the wall seemed to grow louder, each second stretching like a taut wire. I stared at my screen for hours, trying to remember what I had originally written. What was missing? The silence in my apartment felt suffocating now, oppressive. I couldn't get the word out of my head, but every time I tried to force it into my story, it didn't fit. The gap refused to close. And yet, the more I resisted, the more it seemed to press in on me. That night, sleep didn't come easy. My dreams were filled with flashes of the word, flickering in and out of my consciousness, always just out of reach. I woke up several times, drenched in sweat, heart pounding. It felt like the word was chasing me, growing larger, swallowing everything in its path. The next morning, the feeling didn't go away. If anything, it had intensified. I left the apartment early, trying to clear my head with a walk. I thought maybe getting some fresh air would help. But even then, the word lingered, as if following me, lurking in the corner of my thoughts. I walked the same route as the day before, hoping the distance would ease the unease in my chest. But when I passed the same spot, I saw it again. The billboard. And the word. It had changed, slightly. This time, it was more pronounced. The letters were sharper, more defined. Almost alive. I stopped, my breath caught in my throat. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I couldn't move. I couldn't look away. My feet were frozen to the pavement, as if the word itself had taken root in the ground beneath me. A woman, passing by, noticed my stillness and gave me an odd look, but I didn't care. I couldn't focus on her, or anyone. I was staring at the ad, waiting for something. Then it happened. A gust of wind blew through the street. It was sudden and unexpected, and it sent the papers of a nearby kiosk fluttering into the air. But I barely noticed. What caught my attention, what snapped me out of my trance, was a voice. A voice that came from nowhere. It wasn't loud. It wasn't even clear at first. But I heard it. Soft, like a whisper carried on the wind. You're looking in the wrong place. I turned sharply, searching for the source, but there was no one. The street was as ordinary as it had been moments before. People were walking by, chatting, laughing, going about their business. But something had changed in the air, something had shifted. I could feel it now, deep in my bones. The voice had come from nowhere. I tried to dismiss it. My mind raced to find an explanation. Maybe it was a random thought. Maybe I had imagined it, but no. I knew what I heard. It was real. And now it was following me. I tried to shake it off, but I couldn't. I kept walking, my pace quickening, trying to outrun the discomfort in my chest, the unease clawing at my thoughts. I couldn't go back to my apartment, not yet. Not in this state of mind. Instead, I turned a corner and made my way down a quieter street one I hadn't walked down in months. It was a place I used to visit often when I wanted to escape the noise, the hustle of the city. There was a park near the end of the street, one with benches and trees that offered shade even on the brightest days. I walked deeper into the park, the green space offering some solace from the chaos of my thoughts. But even here, in the quiet of the park, the feeling lingered. You're looking in the wrong place. The voice again. This time, it was clearer. And it felt closer. I froze. And then I saw it. A man standing in the distance, under the shade of a large oak tree. He was staring straight at me. I couldn't make out his features, his face obscured by the shadows of the tree, but there was something wrong about him. Something familiar. I knew I shouldn't approach. I knew I should turn around and leave. But my legs moved of their own accord, dragging me closer. And as I reached him, I heard the voice again, only this time it was coming from him. It's time you remembered. I took a step back, my heart hammering in my chest. Suddenly, I realized I wasn't just looking in the wrong place. I had been looking in the wrong direction. I stumbled backward, my feet tripping over the uneven ground. My mind spun, the air around me thick with something heavy, suffocating. The man under the oak tree didn't move. His face remained hidden in shadow, but there was a strange presence around him, a feeling that made my skin crawl. I took another step back, and then another, my heart hammering so loudly in my chest that I thought the sound would swallow me whole. I couldn't take my eyes off him. It was as if something invisible was pulling me toward him, pushing me to confront whatever I was too scared to face. But as I looked at him, something in me told me that I shouldn't. I shouldn't get any closer. I shouldn't engage with him. He wasn't just a stranger in a park. He wasn't even a person, not really. He was something else. Something other. The voice came again, clearer this time, but this time it wasn't a whisper. It was an unmistakable command, as if it came from deep inside my head. From my very soul. You know what's missing. You know what you forgot. I froze. My blood ran cold. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I didn't want to remember. I didn't want to know. I turned and ran. I didn't care where I was going anymore. I just needed to get away from that man, from that voice, from everything that felt so wrong. I burst out of the park and onto the street, my feet pounding the pavement as I fled, the world around me a blur of motion. But as I ran, I couldn't shake the image of the man standing in the park, the shadows swallowing his face. And the words, those words that haunted me now, you know what's missing. It wasn't just about the word in my manuscript anymore. It was bigger than that. It was something deeper, something buried in the corners of my mind, just waiting to come to the surface. I don't know how far I ran, or how much time passed. I only know that when I finally stopped, I was outside my apartment again, panting, drenched in sweat, my mind a tangle of fear and confusion. I went inside, locked the door behind me, and collapsed onto the couch. My heart was still racing, my head spinning with the image of the man, with his voice, with the word I had lost. I tried to focus on something, anything, to distract myself. I opened my laptop again, hoping that if I worked, I could bury the fear deep enough to forget. But the file was still open. My manuscript staring back at me with its empty spaces, its gaps. The missing word. The thing that felt so elusive, so untouchable. I thought I could ignore it, but I couldn't. It was as if the word was pulling me toward it, demanding to be found. I scrolled through the pages. The missing word wasn't just one gap anymore. It had spread, like a virus, infecting whole sections of the text. Whole paragraphs had gone blank, erased, as if they had never existed. The story I had worked so hard to create was slipping away from me, piece by piece. I stared at the screen, my hands trembling. The word was still missing. Still gone. I leaned closer to the monitor, my eyes locked on the blank spaces. Then, suddenly, my eyes stopped on a sentence I hadn't noticed before. A sentence that seemed new. It had appeared there, as if by magic, since the last time I'd looked at it. The sentence was strange, out of place. "You're looking in the wrong place." I recoiled, the words hitting me like a physical blow. It was the same phrase. The same voice. I didn't want to believe it. I didn't want to acknowledge that the sentence had just appeared. I wanted to shut the laptop, to run out of the apartment and never look back. But I couldn't. I had to know. I had to understand what was happening. I reached out to touch the keyboard, my fingers moving of their own accord. And as I typed, my hands shaking, I added the word I had been searching for, the word that had haunted me, the word that had appeared in that advertisement and under the oak tree, the word that was now a part of my very thoughts. I pressed enter. Remember. The sentence, once so simple, now held a weight, a presence that pressed down on me, making it hard to breathe. And then, the screen flickered. At first, I thought it was a glitch. But then it happened again. And again. Until the screen was no longer the manuscript I had been working on. It was something else. A room. A familiar room. I could see myself sitting there, staring at the screen, typing. I could see the clutter of my apartment, the coffee mug beside me. But there was something wrong with the reflection in the screen. It wasn't right. I wasn't alone. A figure stood behind me. I turned, but there was no one there. Yet I could still see them in the screen, in the reflection. They were right there, standing behind me, watching. The man. The one from the park. The one whose voice had followed me, whose words had taunted me. He was standing there, his face still hidden in shadow. His eyes, though, glowed in the darkness, like twin embers. Watching. Waiting. You've remembered. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But I couldn't move. I couldn't even breathe. It was as if the very air had thickened, become something heavier, something colder. And then the screen went black. The words vanished. The man disappeared. I was alone again. But something had changed. The missing word wasn't missing anymore. It was inside me. And I knew what it meant. I couldn't move. I sat frozen in front of the dark screen, my breath shallow, my body rigid. The silence in the room was absolute, but it felt suffocating. My heart pounded in my chest as I waited for something, anything, to happen. But the longer I sat there, the more I realized that nothing was going to happen. The man was gone, the screen was dark, and everything in my apartment felt too still. Too quiet. I tried to convince myself that it was over. That it had all been a hallucination, a product of stress and fatigue. But even as I thought that, I knew it wasn't true. The feeling, the heaviness in the air, the dread that still clung to me like a second skin, it was still here. It hadn't left. I reached out, trembling, to turn the laptop back on. My fingers hovered above the keyboard, but I couldn't bring myself to touch the keys. It felt like there was something waiting for me on the other side of the screen. Something I wasn't ready to face. The longer I sat there, the more the weight of the silence pressed in. I felt like I was being watched again. It wasn't just a feeling that came and went. It was constant now, like a presence lingering in the corners of my vision. The shadows in the room seemed deeper. The air, colder. I stood up suddenly, needing to move, to break the paralysis that had taken over my body. I paced back and forth, my mind a whirlpool of confusion and fear. What did the word remember mean? Why had it appeared in my story? And why did it feel so personal? I walked to the window, hoping the fresh air would help clear my thoughts. The city outside was just as it always was, busy, alive, unaware. People walked down the street, cars honked, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. Everything was normal. Too normal. But something felt wrong. I couldn't shake the sense that something had changed. That something was missing. I turned away from the window, my eyes scanning the room. My gaze settled on the small bookshelf in the corner. It was filled with old, tattered novels, notes, journals from years past. I hadn't looked through them in months, maybe longer. But something about them seemed to call to me now. I walked over to the shelf, pulling one of the old journals from its place. It was the first one I ever wrote in. My thoughts from when I was just starting out, filled with hope and excitement. I opened it, flipping through the pages. Each word, each sentence, felt distant, as if written by someone else. But then I stopped. A page near the back of the journal was torn. It was a small tear, as though the page had been ripped out quickly. But I knew I hadn't done it. I had never torn any pages from this journal. I leaned in closer, scanning the remaining text. The words on the page stopped me cold. "You're looking in the wrong place." The same phrase. The same words. The ones that had been haunting me. I felt my stomach churn. My hands began to shake. I flipped through the journal, each page I turned revealing more gaps. More missing sentences, more torn fragments. All of them led back to that same phrase, that same voice. My thoughts raced. How could this be? The journal was from years ago. Before the manuscript, before the missing word, before the ad and the man in the park. How could this be happening? But then I saw it. The final page of the journal, the last page I had ever written on. And there it was, in bold, messy handwriting, my own handwriting, the word I had been searching for, the word that had been absent from my manuscript, the word that had been haunting me for days. Remember. I dropped the journal, stumbling backward, my chest tightening with panic. The room spun around me, the walls closing in. This couldn't be real. It couldn't be. The word, it was in my past, and yet it was also in my present. It had been following me, piece by piece, leading me down this path that I hadn't wanted to take. The voice came again, this time not from the page, not from the screen, but from inside my head. You've forgotten, but it's time to remember. I gripped the edge of the bookshelf, trying to steady myself. My vision blurred as tears welled up in my eyes. I couldn't breathe. My chest felt like it was being crushed under the weight of something terrible, something old. I didn't want to remember. I couldn't. I stumbled to the door, desperate to leave, to escape whatever this was. But as I reached for the handle, I stopped. A thought, sharp and clear, sliced through the fog of panic. It wasn't just a word that had been missing. It was me. I had forgotten something. Forgotten myself. The realization hit me with the force of a freight train. The word remember wasn't just a reminder about my writing. It wasn't just some coincidence that had been planted in my story. It was a message. A message meant for me. I wasn't the person I thought I was. Not anymore. The door to my apartment opened with a soft creak, as if inviting me to step into the unknown. The street outside seemed darker now, the air thicker. It felt like the world had changed again, just as it had in my apartment. And I realized something else. This wasn't just happening to me. This wasn't just my story. The voice. The missing word. The gaps in time and memory. It was all part of a pattern. A pattern that was leading me somewhere. Somewhere I didn't want to go. I stepped out into the night, the shadows of the city stretching long and dark around me. But I knew now. It wasn't the city that was changing. It was me. And I had to remember. I walked into the night, my body moving almost mechanically, as if my feet knew where to go, even if my mind didn't. The city was alive around me, people moving quickly, unaware of the shift in the air, the strange heaviness that clung to me like a shadow. The streetlights flickered above, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to follow me wherever I went. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to keep moving, had to get away from the apartment, from the room, from the nightmare I could feel closing in on me. But the more I walked, the more the world around me began to feel unfamiliar. The streets were the same, yet something was off. A slight tilt to the horizon, a faint hum in the air that seemed to grow louder the further I went. I didn't want to look back, but I couldn't help it. Every step felt like I was being pulled towards something, towards somewhere. And when I turned my head, I saw him. The man. Standing at the end of the street, just beyond the reach of the streetlight's glow. He wasn't in shadow this time. His face was fully visible, and I could see the faint, twisted smile that had haunted my thoughts since the first night. His eyes glowed, no longer hidden by darkness. They were almost welcoming. "You've remembered," he said, his voice a low hum that vibrated in my chest. It was the same voice that had echoed in my head, the same voice that had taunted me through the manuscript, through the journal. It was familiar now, but not in any comforting way. It was the voice of something ancient. Something dangerous. I stopped, my feet rooted to the ground, every muscle in my body frozen. The world around me seemed to blur, the sounds of the city fading into a dull thrum, like I was underwater. "Don't fight it," the man said, his smile widening, his voice still that unnerving blend of soothing and sinister. "You know the truth now. You can't escape it. You can't escape me." I took a step back. My heart was in my throat. "You've been chasing it for so long, haven't you?" he continued, trying to fill the gap, the hole, the part of you that was always missing. "You never understood. Not until now." I shook my head, but the words kept coming, flowing like a torrent I couldn't stop. No, no, you're wrong. I don't know what you're talking about. But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. I did know. I could feel it inside me, the emptiness, the void that had always been there, the feeling that I had been incomplete, that I was missing something essential. Something that had been taken from me. The man's figure seemed to grow larger, the space around him warping. The world twisted, the familiar street distorting into something dark and alien. The streetlights bent unnaturally, their halos casting eerie glows that didn't quite reach the ground. The air grew colder, like winter had suddenly gripped the city in its icy fingers. I don't need you to remember, not anymore, the man said. His voice now had a different tone. It was softer, almost pitying. You already know everything. Everything you need to know. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. My mind was flooded with images, flashes of forgotten moments, things I couldn't place. Faces, places, names. They all swirled together, colliding into a mess of confusion. But there was one thing that stood out above the rest. A door. A door I had opened long ago, but had forgotten. It was in my mind now, this door. I could feel it, sense it, on the edge of my memory, just beyond my reach. It was there, behind everything else, buried deep in the recesses of my mind. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that I had always known it was there. It's time, the man said, his voice almost gentle now. It's time to open it. I didn't want to. I didn't want to face it. But the more I resisted, the more the door felt real, the more it pressed on me. It was a part of me, and it had always been there, waiting for me to remember. The ground beneath me began to crack, the asphalt splitting open like a wound. I stepped back, the cracks widening, but my feet felt heavy, like they were sinking into the earth. The sky above was no longer dark, but an unnatural shade of gray. The world felt wrong. The man's form flickered, distorted like a mirage. He stepped forward, but now his movements were jerky, unnatural, as if the world around him was beginning to tear apart. You will remember, he whispered. And then you'll understand. I had no choice. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and reached for the door. I could feel it now, the cold metal of the handle, the texture of the wood. It was like 1,000 memories rushing at me, trying to suffocate me with their weight. I turned the handle. The door creaked open, and in the dark room behind it, I saw myself. The real me. A version of myself that I had forgotten, locked away, hidden for so long. You didn't remember because you were afraid to, my reflection said, its voice a perfect echo of my own, yet off. It was as if it wasn't me, but something that looked like me. But it's too late now. The truth is here. And there's no going back. I stepped back, the door swinging open wider. Inside, the darkness swirled and twisted, but the reflection in the dark room was still there, staring back at me with those glowing eyes. Eyes that were no longer mine. And in that moment, I knew the worst part of all. The man. The voice. The gaps in the manuscript. It was all a part of me. Something I had forgotten. Something I had pushed away. The darkness in the room reached for me, and I realized then that the door wasn't the thing I had opened. It was me, and I would never close it again. Have you ever come across a phone number that you're certain you never saved? I did, last week. and I still can't explain it. It happened on a quiet Wednesday evening. I was sitting on my couch, scrolling through my phone. A typical night, nothing out of the ordinary. I'd just finished a project for work and was looking for something to distract me. So, I opened my contacts list to send a message to an old friend, someone I hadn't spoken to in a while. That's when I saw it. There, in my list of contacts, was a number I didn't recognize. The name attached to it was familiar though. It was mine. My own name, sitting next to a phone number that wasn't in my memory at all. I stared at the screen, blinking several times. It didn't make sense. I knew every contact I had saved. I was the kind of person who double-checked my contacts regularly, who kept everything organized. I hadn't added a new contact in weeks, and certainly not with my own name. I tapped on it, my fingers hovering over the screen, unsure of what to do. The number was long, too long, in fact. It looked almost like an old international number, a landline from some country I hadn't visited in years. It had no recent messages or calls attached to it, which only made it more confusing. I didn't add this number. I was sure of it. I opened the message history. Nothing. Not a single conversation. Just an empty thread with my name above it. But the weirdest part was that the phone number, it was mine. It was like I had somehow saved it, but at the same time, I hadn't. I closed the contact and opened a new message, trying to push the unsettling feeling away. But something kept pulling me back. What if someone had hacked my phone? Or maybe it was some strange glitch in the system? I wasn't sure, but I had to figure it out. So, I did what anyone would do in this situation. I called the number. It rang a few times before the line picked up. I held my breath, waiting for someone to speak, but there was only silence at first, dead, suffocating silence. Then came a voice. Hello? It was my voice. Or at least, it sounded like it. The tone, the way the words were said, it was almost exactly like my own voice. But something about it was off. There was a coldness to it, something distant. I didn't respond. My throat was tight, my heart pounding in my chest. The line went quiet again for a long moment. Then, the voice spoke again. You should know better than to call me. It wasn't a threat, exactly. It was more like a warning. A calm, yet ominous statement that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I didn't know what to say. I was paralyzed, the phone heavy in my hand. The silence stretched on, as if it was waiting for me to say something, but I couldn't. It felt like I was talking to myself, but I wasn't. Just as I was about to hang up, the voice broke the silence again. You'll regret this, it said softly. Then, the line went dead. I sat there in shock, the phone still pressed to my ear. I couldn't move. I couldn't think. All I could hear was the faint static in the background, the quiet hum of the dead line. The screen of my phone dimmed, and I quickly ended the call. My hands were shaking, my palms sweating. I looked at the number again, my mind racing. How was that possible? It wasn't just a strange coincidence. That was my voice, but it wasn't me. I looked around the room, my eyes scanning the familiar surroundings. The apartment was the same as always, nothing seemed out of place, nothing looked unusual. But there was a shift in the air, a tension that I couldn't explain. It was as if something was wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I tried to tell myself that it was just some prank. Maybe it was a wrong number, or a technical glitch, or even a dream. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. That voice, my voice, wasn't supposed to be there. I needed answers, but I wasn't sure where to start. The number didn't show up in my call log, and there were no other clues. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. The more I thought about it, the more it felt like a warning. Something was coming. Something I wasn't ready for. The next morning, I woke up late, groggy, but I couldn't shake the unease from the night before. As I sat down to drink my coffee, I grabbed my phone again, trying to distract myself by checking the news or social media. But the first thing that caught my eye was the same number. It was there again, still in my contacts list, still attached to my name. I clicked on it once more. This time, I didn't hesitate. I sent a message. "Who is this?" It felt strange typing those words, as if I was writing to myself. I waited, but the response came almost immediately. "You already know." I froze, my mind racing. There was something chilling about the message, something that sent a wave of nausea through my stomach. "What do you want?" The reply was quick, too quick. "I'm just here to remind you. It's time." Time for what? I had no idea. But the feeling of dread was growing inside me, like something was unfolding, something from my past that I had forgotten, or maybe I just never wanted to remember. I was in over my head. I put the phone down, staring at the screen, trying to make sense of it. But deep down, I could feel it, the quiet, creeping sensation that I wasn't alone anymore. That something, or someone, was watching me. And it wasn't just through my phone. I stood up, pacing around the room. I had to find out who was behind this. I had to understand what was happening. But the more I tried to rationalize it, the more my mind rejected it. Nothing made sense. The number, the voice, the message, it was all connected to something I wasn't seeing. I wasn't sure what I was getting into, but I had to find out. The next few days passed in a blur, a strange, almost surreal haze. I couldn't concentrate on anything. Work became a distant thought, my morning routine felt mechanical, and my interactions with friends or family were robotic. The number kept appearing in my contacts, like some sort of digital ghost. Every time I glanced at my phone, it was there, an eerie reminder of something I couldn't quite grasp. I tried to ignore it, I really did. But then the messages started again. "Where are you?" I stared at the screen for a long time before I could bring myself to respond. Part of me knew that answering would just make things worse. But another part, something that had been growing louder inside me, something almost desperate, wanted to know what would happen if I did. "Who is this?" The reply came almost instantly, as if it had been waiting for me to ask. "You know who I am." I froze. My fingers trembled as I gripped the phone tighter, almost as if the words were physically pressing down on me. My mind raced. Could this be a prank? But it felt wrong, too wrong to be just a joke. And why did it feel like this message was tailored specifically to me? "Why are you doing this?" I typed, the words slipping out before I could second guess them. My heart beat faster as I waited for a response. "Because you didn't listen before." The air around me seemed to thicken, the weight of the words settling in my chest. I didn't know what this person, this voice, this presence wanted from me, but it felt like it was getting closer. A few hours later, I was sitting at my kitchen table, staring at the number again. The messages had stopped, and for a brief moment, I allowed myself to think it was over. Maybe it was just some bizarre mistake, a glitch. But then I heard a soft buzz from my phone. A new notification. Look outside. I stood up immediately, my breath catching in my throat. Outside? My eyes darted toward the window, my mind running wild. There was no way this person, whoever they were, could see me. Could they? I was on the 3rd floor of a building, my apartment facing a busy street. I opened the blinds carefully, peering out into the darkening street below. At first, I saw nothing out of the ordinary. Pedestrians walked by, a car honked in the distance, a dog barked somewhere down the block. But then, just as I was about to pull away, I noticed something strange. Across the street, in front of an old bookstore, a figure was standing. It was hard to make out at first, just a shadow in the fading light. But then, it moved, stepping out from the darkness and into the dim glow of a street lamp. It was a man. I squinted, my heart pounding. The figure was far enough away that I couldn't make out any details, but there was something about the way he stood, so still and unmoving, that made me feel uneasy. I felt like I was being watched, studied. My hand trembled as I grabbed the phone again. Who is that? I typed, my fingers shaking. There was no immediate response. I watched the figure across the street, waiting for him to do something, anything that would give me a clue. But he didn't move. He just stood there, staring up at my building. And then, finally, the message arrived. He's waiting for you. My stomach churned. I backed away from the window, my eyes wide with panic. No, this couldn't be real. It couldn't. My thoughts raced. Was this a prank? Had someone figured out where I lived? But as I stood there, frozen in place, another message appeared. Don't go outside. I didn't even have time to process it before the world outside shifted. The figure moved. Slowly, deliberately, he took one step toward the entrance of the building across the street. Then another. My heart stopped. I watched him disappear through the doorway, heading toward the building that looked abandoned at night. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to call the police. But what could I say? There's a man standing outside my apartment, and I think he's waiting for me? It sounded insane. I closed the blinds and sat back down at my kitchen table. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was in over my head. Every decision I made felt wrong. Every thought I had seemed like it was leading me further into this tangled mess. I grabbed the phone again, mind racing. I had to get to the bottom of this. I couldn't just sit here and wait. What does he want? I typed. A few moments later, the response came. You should have listened. My fingers hovered over the keys, but I couldn't bring myself to respond. I just stared at the words, the weight of them pressing on me, pushing my thoughts into chaos. There was no way out of this. There was no way to ignore it anymore. I had to face whatever this was, even if I didn't understand it. And that's when I realized something. The number, the messages, the figure outside, this wasn't random. It was too specific, too precise. Whoever, or whatever, was behind this, they knew exactly who I was. And maybe, just maybe, they knew something about me that I didn't. I had to find out. I had no choice but to follow the clues, to go deeper into this mystery. But the closer I got to the truth, the more I felt like I was losing myself. It was like I was being pulled towards something that I couldn't escape. And each time I tried to pull away, the force pulling me grew stronger. The doorbell rang. I froze. The doorbell echoed through the silence of my apartment like a gunshot. My heart pounded in my chest, my blood turning cold in my veins. I hadn't expected anyone. I hadn't heard anyone knock, no footsteps outside, just that single, sharp ring that seemed to reverberate through my bones. I stood frozen for a moment, unable to move. My mind screamed at me to run, to lock all the windows, to hide, but my body didn't listen. Instead, I slowly walked toward the door, each step heavy, like I was walking through thick mud. The hallway outside was dark. The only light came from the overhead bulb, flickering like it was trying to tell me something I didn't want to hear. I reached the door and stood there for what felt like an eternity, my hand hovering over the handle. My breath came in shallow, ragged gasps. Should I open it? Was this the moment I'd been waiting for? Or was this a trap? It's not real. It's just a prank, I thought, trying to convince myself. But the nagging doubt at the back of my mind told me otherwise. I looked down at my phone. There were no new messages. No warnings. Just the silence. Taking a deep breath, I gripped the door handle and pulled. The door creaked open, and I stood there in the dim light, staring at the empty hallway. Nothing. The space in front of me was still and quiet. I scanned the hallway, my eyes darting back and forth, half expecting someone or something to appear from the shadows. But there was nothing. No one. I let out a sigh of relief, though it didn't last long. The feeling that something was terribly wrong lingered in the air, a cold, oppressive weight. It was almost as if the apartment itself was holding its breath. I stepped out into the hallway, cautiously looking around. The floor creaked under my feet, and I winced at the sound. Every noise now seemed to carry an eerie significance, as if the walls were listening. I turned to head back into the apartment when I noticed it. A small piece of paper, tucked just under the doorframe, barely visible in the dim light. I bent down and picked it up. My fingers trembled as I unfolded it, the paper feeling cold against my skin. It was a note. You should have listened. I froze, my blood running cold. The message was exactly the same as the one from the phone. It was too much. Too many coincidences. How was this possible? How could whoever was behind this know exactly what I was thinking? I stared at the note for a long time, unsure of what to do next. My mind was spinning, my thoughts tangled in confusion. I thought about calling the police, but the rational part of me knew it would do no good. What could I tell them? That I received mysterious messages from my own phone number and now there was a cryptic note at my door? They'd think I was losing my mind. I heard something then, faint but distinct. A sound that seemed to come from behind me. Footsteps. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat, but again, nothing. The hallway remained empty. I stepped back inside the apartment, locking the door behind me. My hands were clammy as I leaned against the door, trying to steady my breathing. It had to be a trick. It had to be someone from my past, some prankster trying to get a rise out of me. But everything felt wrong. The messages, the note, the way I felt like I was being watched, it was all too much. I pulled my phone from my pocket again, checking for new messages, but there was nothing. Not a single notification. Why now? I thought. Why this? My eyes lingered on the contact list. That strange number with my own name was still there, taunting me like it was waiting for something. Something I wasn't seeing. And then, I saw it. The name next to the number, it wasn't just my name. There was a date too. 23 October. The date was 2 days away, but I didn't remember adding it. I didn't remember anything about this contact. What does it mean? My finger hovered over the contact. A strange, irresistible pulse seemed to urge me to tap on it. I had to know more. I had to understand what was happening. Before I could move, the phone buzzed. A new message. It's time. I didn't hesitate this time. I tapped the contact. The call connected instantly. I held my breath, waiting for the sound of the line connecting, but there was no dial tone. Just silence. Dead silence. Then, that voice came through. But this time, it was different. It wasn't just the same voice as before, it was distorted, twisted. It was like a whisper, but stretched thin, like it was coming from somewhere far away. You've been waiting for this. I couldn't respond. My mouth was dry. My hands were shaking so violently I could hardly hold the phone. You've always known. But you couldn't remember. Couldn't see. The voice grew louder, almost as if it was in the room with me. I've been waiting for you. I didn't recognize the voice anymore. It wasn't mine. It wasn't anyone I knew. It sounded like something else. The air in the room felt thick now, almost suffocating. I looked around, half expecting someone to step out of the shadows, but there was nothing. No one. The voice continued, a low hum vibrating through the phone. I'm closer than you think. Suddenly, the call ended, leaving me in the oppressive silence. I dropped the phone onto the table, my heart pounding in my chest, my mind reeling. The room felt colder now. I could feel the air press against my skin, heavy and unnatural. The doorbell rang again. This time, I didn't move. I couldn't. The voice on the phone echoed in my mind, growing louder. Closer than you think. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to answer the door. But I knew, deep down, that I had no choice. I stood there, staring at the door. Waiting. It's time. And for the first time, I knew it wasn't just a message. It was a promise. A promise I couldn't escape. I stood frozen, my hands still resting on the doorknob, my pulse thundering in my ears. The room around me seemed to close in, the walls pressing inward like they were trying to swallow me whole. I could hear the steady hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the creak of the old wooden floor beneath my feet, but everything felt distant. Like the sounds were really there, like I was submerged in water. The doorbell rang again, louder this time, more urgent. I had to move. I had no choice. With a trembling hand, I turned the knob, pushing the door open slowly, the hinges creaking in protest. I stepped out into the hallway, but the moment my feet hit the cold, tiled floor, I knew something was wrong. The hallway looked different. The light above flickered unnaturally, casting long, stretching shadows that twisted in strange, unnatural shapes. The air felt heavier, thick with the sense of something lurking just out of sight. I stepped back, eyes darting around, but there was no one in the hallway. No one standing at the door. But I could feel it. I could feel the presence. I turned back to look inside my apartment, half expecting someone to be standing there, waiting for me. But there was nothing. The door was still wide open, the apartment eerily quiet. And then I heard it again. A faint sound, like a whisper, coming from the darkness of the hallway. Soft, almost like a murmur, but unmistakable. My name. Ryan. The voice was low, raspy, and so close that it sent a chill down my spine. I spun around, my heart racing, but there was no one there. I felt a shiver run through me, a cold, clammy feeling that settled in my chest. The air seemed to freeze around me, and for a moment, I thought I could hear something else. A low, guttural hum that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I backed away from the door, my breath shallow, chest tightening with panic. What is this? I thought. Who is doing this? And then, through the haze of fear and confusion, I remembered something I had almost forgotten in the chaos of it all. The note. The one that had been under the door. You should have listened. I hadn't listened. But it was too late for that now. I had to act. I had to stop this before it got worse. Whatever this was, it wasn't just a prank, it wasn't just some sick joke. It was real. And it was closing in on me. I reached for my phone, my fingers shaking as I unlocked it. I opened the contact list again, staring at that strange number, the one that wasn't supposed to exist. The one that was mine. I tapped it again, the call connecting immediately. This time, there was no silence. No waiting. A voice answered almost immediately, but it wasn't the same voice as before. It was deeper, more distorted, as though it had passed through layers of static, a voice that was both familiar and foreign. You know why you're here. My stomach twisted. It was as if the voice knew exactly what I was thinking, what I had feared all along. I don't understand, I stammered, my voice sounding strange to my own ears. It didn't feel like mine, not anymore. You never do you? The words felt like ice in my veins. You can never remember. The voice continued, now almost mocking. You thought you could run from this. From what you did. But you can't, Ryan. You can't hide. The mention of my name made my chest tighten, a sickening knot forming in my throat. How did it know? How did it know what I had done? I haven't done anything. What do you want from me? My voice cracked as I spoke, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The voice on the other end chuckled, the sound chilling, almost mechanical. It's not what I want from you, Ryan. It's what you've been waiting for. I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck, my pulse hammering. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. What I've been waiting for. No, I whispered. I don't understand. You will. The voice's tone grew colder, more detached. The door is already open, Ryan. You just have to walk through it. The phone went dead. The line went silent, the only sound the quiet buzzing of the call disconnecting. I dropped the phone onto the counter, my hand shaking violently. I had to get out of here. I had to leave. I had to do something. This couldn't be happening. But my feet wouldn't move. My body refused to obey. I stared at the door, the hallway beyond it now shrouded in darkness. The shadows seemed to grow longer, more ominous, as if they were reaching out to me. Then, I saw it. A figure standing in the doorway. A man. I couldn't see his face, just the silhouette of him, framed by the dim light behind him. His body was rigid, unmoving, and I could feel his eyes on me, even though I couldn't see them. The feeling was suffocating, oppressive. Like he was inside my mind, watching me, waiting for something. You should have listened, the figure whispered. My heart skipped a beat. It was the same words from the note, the same voice from the phone. It was him. I stepped back, my heart racing, my breath ragged. But the figure didn't move. He just stood there, silent. Then, slowly, he raised a hand and pointed at me. "Come with me." It wasn't a request. It was a command. I turned and ran. I don't know how or why, but I couldn't stop myself. I ran through the apartment, straight for the back door. I yanked it open and bolted outside, into the night, into the unknown. But as I looked back, I knew he was following me. And no matter where I went, he would always be closer than I thought. I ran. I ran like I had never run before, my legs burning, my chest heaving, my mind screaming at me to stop, to think, to do anything other than keep going. But there was no thinking now, no reasoning. All I knew was that I had to get away. That figure, whoever, whatever it was still out there, just behind me, its presence like a dark cloud over my every step. It was suffocating, suffusing the air around me with an icy dread that refused to leave. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't care. My apartment, my neighborhood, it all felt too close, too familiar, and that made it worse. I had to escape. My feet pounded against the cracked pavement, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The streets were eerily quiet, but the silence was only making it worse. I could almost feel the figure, that malevolent presence, closing in on me like it was just a breath away. Every shadow, every flicker of movement made my pulse spike. I kept my eyes darting, scanning the streets, searching for any sign of movement, of life. But there was nothing. Just the sound of my own footsteps, pounding against the empty streets, echoing back at me. I don't know how far I ran. The street lights above me grew dimmer, as if they were losing power. The shadows stretched further, their dark fingers creeping closer. The world around me was slipping into some unnatural twilight, and I didn't know if it was the time of day or something else entirely. I found myself in an unfamiliar alley, a narrow, dark passage between two buildings. I had never been here before, and that should have been a relief, but all it did was make the situation worse. The air felt thicker here, oppressive. The shadows pressed in around me. And then I heard it. The whisper again. Ryan. It was low, so close to my ear, but when I spun around, there was no one behind me. Nothing but darkness. I pressed my back against the brick wall, my heart racing. I could feel the coolness of the stone against my skin, but the fear inside me was a burning fire. The world felt wrong. Everything felt wrong. And then I saw it. A phone lying on the ground in front of me. At first, I thought it was just some random object discarded carelessly in the alley. But then I saw the screen. It was cracked, spiderwebbed with fractures that radiated out from the center. And then, as if on cue, the screen lit up. It was my phone number. No, it couldn't be. I stumbled forward, my heart thumping in my chest. I reached for it, hands trembling, and when I touched it, the screen flashed, and for a moment, I saw a message. You shouldn't have run. The message disappeared almost immediately, leaving the screen blank once more. I felt a cold chill crawl up my spine. I backed away, my mind spinning, my thoughts jumbled. This is it. This was what I had been waiting for, whatever this was. It had finally caught up with me. The silence in the alley deepened, the stillness suffocating. My hands were shaking, my pulse quickening as I looked around. What was happening to me? And then I heard it. The doorbell. It echoed in the distance, muffled and faint, but unmistakable. It wasn't the doorbell from my apartment. It was something else, coming from somewhere deeper, further down the alley. A sound I couldn't explain, but I could feel it. I started to walk toward it, my body moving without my permission, drawn by the strange pull of that sound. With each step, the air grew colder, the shadows deeper. The echo of the bell grew louder, clearer. I felt my chest tighten, my throat constricting with a panic I couldn't explain. But I had no choice. I had to keep moving forward. And then I saw it. At the end of the alley, bathed in the flickering light of a distant street lamp, stood a door. It wasn't just any door, it was my door. The door from my apartment. The same one I had left behind only minutes ago, but now it was standing here in the middle of the alley, just waiting for me. The doorbell rang again. I couldn't go back. I couldn't. But my feet were moving toward it anyway, one step after another, as if they had a mind of their own. My heart pounded in my chest, the sound of it deafening in my ears, but it didn't matter. I had no control anymore. It was like I was being dragged back to that place, back to whatever it was that had been waiting for me all this time. When I reached the door, I hesitated. My hand hovered over the knob, and for a moment, I thought I might be able to turn and run to escape this nightmare for good. But then I heard the voice again. You've been waiting for this. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I just reached out, and the door swung open with a slow, creaking groan. And then everything went black. The morning light came slowly, stretching across the city as it always did, bringing with it the sounds of the waking world, the rustle of leaves, the hum of cars, the chatter of people on their way to work. But there was something different about today. The world felt a little quieter, a little more distant. When I opened my eyes, I was lying on the floor of my apartment. My body felt heavy, as if it had been through something I couldn't quite remember. I sat up slowly, rubbing my eyes. My apartment was still here, still the same. Nothing was out of place. Except the phone. It was sitting on the counter, just as I had left it. I reached for it, my fingers trembling. The screen lit up. I didn't even need to check the contacts. I already knew. There it was. The number. My number. But it wasn't just in my phone anymore. It was everywhere. On the walls. On the windows. On the door. And when I looked out the window, I saw him. The man. The figure. Standing at the end of the street. Waiting. Have you ever had the feeling that something from your past is trying to reach you? Something forgotten, something buried deep inside? I had that feeling one cold autumn evening when I found my old childhood diary in the back of my closet. It had been years, decades, really, since I last saw it. My mother had kept it packed away with other things when I moved out of the house. I'd forgotten about it. Until now. The closet in my new apartment was small, nothing special. There were boxes of old books, sweaters I hadn't worn in years, and dusty keepsakes. But when my hand brushed against something beneath a pile of old clothes, something felt different. There it was, hidden under an old coat, my diary. The leather cover was cracked, and the pages inside were yellowed with age. I could smell the familiar scent of old paper, and it brought back a flood of memories. I pulled it out and flipped it open. The first few pages were filled with childish scribbles, innocent enough. Stories about friends, adventures, and dreams that seemed so far away now. But as I continued flipping through, something strange started to happen. I found a page I didn't recognize. There, in my childish handwriting, was a description of a day I had never lived. It was simple, matter of fact. Tomorrow, at exactly 3 o'clock, I will meet someone I haven't seen in years. We'll sit at the park, and I will be scared. The words didn't make sense. I didn't remember writing this. And more unsettlingly, how could I have known something like this would happen? I turned the page quickly, my pulse quickening. But then I found more. At 5 o'clock, someone will call. I won't pick up, but I will feel like I should have. I couldn't breathe. I felt a chill run down my spine. The ink looked like my handwriting, but these words, didn't belong to me. Not now, at least. I shoved the diary back into the box and closed the closet door. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something in that diary, something I wrote, was starting to feel very real. Too real. I didn't know what to think. Could it have been a prank, something I had written as a child and forgotten? It didn't make sense. But when I looked at the clock, the hands were pointing to exactly 3 o'clock. I tried to shake off the discomfort that had settled in my chest. But as the day wore on, I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling. Around 3 o'clock, I found myself pacing the apartment, glancing out the window toward the park across the street. I couldn't help it. I was drawn to it, as if the diary had set some invisible string into motion. And then, I saw him. It was someone I hadn't seen in years, an old friend from my childhood, Tom. He was standing by the park bench, looking lost. For a moment, I felt like I was watching a scene from a dream. He looked exactly the same, almost frozen in time, as if the years had never passed. The strange thing was, I wasn't expecting him. I hadn't seen him in over a decade, and yet here he was, exactly as the diary had said. I swallowed hard, my stomach twisting in a knot. My hands trembled as I fumbled for my phone to check the time. It was 5 o'clock. The diary had said something else too, something about a call. The phone in my hand buzzed. My heart skipped. I almost didn't want to answer, afraid of what would happen next. But I had to. "Hello?" I whispered into the receiver. There was silence on the other end for a moment. Then, the voice I least expected to hear. "Sarah," it said softly. "It's me. You didn't pick up when I called, but I knew you'd hear me eventually." It sounded like Tom. I dropped the phone, feeling like I might collapse right there. The words I had just heard, the words from the diary, were coming true. How could this be happening? I didn't want to believe it. But the feeling that something had already been set into motion, that I was trapped somehow, was growing stronger. I didn't know what to do. Should I go to the park? Should I confront him? What was this all about? The air in the apartment suddenly felt colder, heavier, as if the walls were closing in around me. I walked to the window, glancing outside. The street below was empty, but something didn't feel right. I saw shadows moving in the corners of my vision, too quick to be real. Was it just the light playing tricks on me, or was someone, waiting? The clock ticked louder in my ears. It felt like time was slipping away from me, and I was powerless to stop it. The diary, the call, the strange sense of déjà vu, all of it was converging into one terrifying question. What had I written? What had I predicted? The wind outside howled, a soft whistling sound that seemed to grow louder, pressing against the glass. I turned around, my heart pounding, and saw something that made my blood run cold. There, in the reflection of the window, I saw a figure standing behind me. It was Tom. I spun around. No one was there. But the feeling, the undeniable sense that something was wrong, remained. It had been with me all day, ever since I opened that diary. I had to know more. What was I missing? What had I written about the future, and why did it seem like I was being led towards something terrible? I ran back to the closet, pulling the diary from the box once more. But this time, there was something different. The pages were changing. I stared at the diary in my hands, feeling my pulse race. The pages, which had once been so familiar, so full of childish scribbles, were no longer just filled with memories. Now, they seemed to be shifting, evolving, as if they were alive. As if they were telling me something I wasn't ready to hear. I opened to the last page I had read, where the words had eerily matched everything that was happening in real life. But now, to my horror, the ink was fading. The words were blurring, as though the diary was trying to erase itself, or worse, trying to hide something. With trembling hands, I flipped back a few pages, hoping to find something more, anything that could explain this madness. But instead of finding a passage from my past, I found a completely new entry. One that wasn't there before. The man outside my window is watching me. I can hear his breathing. It sounds like he's waiting for me to make a move. He doesn't want me to leave, but I will have to. Tomorrow. I felt the blood drain from my face. I hadn't written this. There was no way. I couldn't have. My eyes darted to the window, to the shadows outside. It was dark now. The streetlight flickered on, casting an eerie glow across the empty street below. But there, in the reflection of the glass, I could have sworn I saw something, or someone, standing across the street, staring up at my apartment. The figure was tall, thin, and dark against the streetlight. Too still. Too silent. I took a few cautious steps back, clutching the diary to my chest as if it could protect me. My breath was shallow. The fear crept up from my stomach and tightened around my throat. What was going on? How had this diary, something that had been locked away for so long, become a record of events that hadn't even happened yet? And what was this man? Was he the same person from the reflection? The one who seemed to be waiting? Was he watching me right now? I shook my head, trying to focus. Stay calm. Think. I needed to make sense of this. I needed answers. I quickly glanced at the clock. It was almost 7 p.m. The diary had already predicted a few things, what happened at 3, the phone call at 5. If this was real, then there was no telling what would happen next. I didn't want to be alone anymore. I needed to leave the apartment, but where could I go? What if I was just overthinking this? What if I was simply imagining everything? I grabbed my coat and rushed to the door. The moment I stepped out into the hallway, I froze. A loud knock echoed from the door behind me. Not a soft knock. A sharp, insistent knock. My heart pounded in my chest as I turned around slowly, my hand trembling on the doorknob. Who was it? The knock came again, louder this time, followed by a low voice. Sarah, I know you're in there. You can't run away from this. The voice was low, almost a whisper, but it made my skin crawl. It was familiar, but I couldn't place it. I hadn't heard it in years. Was it Tom? Was it the man from the reflection? Or was it someone else entirely? I backed away from the door, my mind racing. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't face whoever it was, knowing that the diary had already predicted this moment. But the diary didn't say what to do next. I bolted down the hallway, my footsteps echoing off the cold tile floors. I couldn't think. I just had to get away. The walls of the apartment seemed to close in on me as I made my way toward the stairs, but as I reached the landing, I stopped dead in my tracks. There, at the foot of the stairs, stood the same man from outside. He was tall, gaunt, wearing a dark coat that blended into the shadows. His face was hidden in the dim light, but I could see his eyes. They were wide open, unblinking, and they were locked onto me. His expression was strange, almost too calm for someone who should have been as terrifying as he seemed. I took a step back. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice shaking, barely louder than a whisper. He didn't answer. Instead, he just raised his hand, pointing toward me. I froze, rooted to the spot. I couldn't move. "You don't remember me, do you?" His voice was rough, like sandpaper against my skin. It was cold and distant, as though it was coming from somewhere deep inside him. I wanted to speak, but no words came. How did he know my name? How did he know I didn't remember him? Was this some sort of sick joke? The man tilted his head slightly, and I realized with a jolt that he looked familiar. His face seemed to flicker with recognition, like a memory I had long since buried. I had seen him before, years ago. But where? When? The air in the hallway felt thicker now, like it was suffocating me. I took a cautious step backward, my mind racing to make sense of the situation. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, and I felt my heartbeat in my ears. "You're not supposed to be here," the man whispered, his eyes narrowing as he took a slow step forward. "You're not supposed to remember." I felt the ground beneath me start to tilt. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think straight. And then it hit me. It wasn't just his voice. His eyes, they were the same. They were the exact same eyes from the diary. I didn't want to accept it. I didn't want to believe it. But I knew, deep down, that I was standing face to face with someone I had never wanted to see again. A memory surged forward, a flash of a time I had tried so desperately to forget. But it wasn't just a memory. It was a warning. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out. Complete darkness. And then, a single, cold whisper filled the silence. "You shouldn't have opened it." The darkness swallowed me whole. My body froze, and for a moment, I thought I had gone blind. The absence of light made everything feel heavier, like the air itself had thickened. My heart hammered in my chest, my ears ringing with the oppressive silence. I could hear the man's breathing, slow and deliberate, just a few feet away. His presence was suffocating, closing in on me like a vice. I didn't dare move, afraid that any sudden motion would trigger something far worse than I could imagine. His whisper lingered in my mind, repeating like a broken record. "You shouldn't have opened it." What did he mean? What was this? The fear was suffocating, but there was something else creeping in, something far colder. A sense of inevitability. Like a curtain slowly falling over me, cutting off any escape. I couldn't stay in the dark. I had to get away. I forced my legs to move, stumbling forward, my hands outstretched to feel my way through the thick shadows. The stairs loomed ahead of me, but as my foot landed on the first step, a voice echoed in the silence. It's too late. The words weren't spoken, they pressed into my skin like fingers trailing down my spine. I jerked back, my breath shallow, my mind racing. How did he know what I was thinking? My hand fumbled for my phone, my fingers slick with sweat. I found it in my pocket and, with trembling hands, managed to turn on the flashlight. The beam of light sliced through the dark, but only a few feet ahead of me. The hallway seemed longer now, stretching into an impossible distance. I glanced back over my shoulder. The man was gone. His figure, his breathing, everything had vanished. But his presence still lingered in the air, thick and unnatural. I didn't know what to believe anymore. Was this a dream? Some nightmare brought on by stress? Or had the diary somehow made this all real? I glanced down at the page again, the one with the words that had come to life, predicting everything that had happened today. The next entry was already forming, written in a hand that wasn't mine. I don't know if I can outrun this. The man's voice is everywhere, in every corner of the house. I feel like I'm being pulled back into something I tried to forget. I had to keep moving. I had to escape. But where could I go? I turned and ran down the hallway, each footstep loud in the silence, each heartbeat thundering in my chest. I reached the door of my apartment and threw it open, stepping into the cold night air outside. The streetlights flickered as I stepped onto the sidewalk, feeling the weight of the world pressing down on me. I took a deep breath, hoping the cool air would calm my nerves, but it only made everything feel more surreal. The street was empty. Too empty. There should have been people around, neighbors walking their dogs, cars passing by, but the silence was so thick it felt wrong. Like the world had paused just for me. I walked quickly, my steps echoing off the concrete, until I reached the small park at the end of the street. The sound of the wind rustling through the trees was the only thing breaking the quiet, but it was so soft, so distant. Everything else was wrong. I looked at my phone again, almost expecting to see another entry from the diary, but there was nothing. The screen was blank, except for the time, 10:05 p.m. I checked the page again. The words hadn't changed, and yet I could feel them pressing in, almost as if they were watching me. My fingers brushed against the edge of the paper. The man outside my window is watching me. I can hear his breathing. It sounds like he's waiting for me to make a move. He doesn't want me to leave, but I will have to. Tomorrow. The words were clear. Tomorrow. Tomorrow was now. It was almost as if I had stepped into the future. Suddenly, I heard something behind me. A soft shuffle of footsteps, slow but deliberate. I spun around, my heart racing. But there was nothing. The park was still empty. Only the rustling of leaves in the wind. I felt foolish. The fear was getting to me. I was imagining things. But still, there was a lingering feeling that I wasn't alone. That something, or someone, was watching. I shook my head, trying to clear it. I had to go back. I needed to face whatever this was, whatever was happening. I needed to figure out the connection between the diary and the man. Maybe if I went back to the apartment, maybe if I... A voice cut through my thoughts. Sarah. I froze. The voice came from behind me, too calm, too familiar. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. There he was, the man from the reflection. Standing at the edge of the park, his silhouette barely visible in the dark. His eyes gleamed, two pinpricks of light in the shadows. You really should have stayed inside, he said, his voice low and rasping. I took a step back, my heart pounding in my chest. Who are you? I demanded. What do you want from me? The man stepped forward, his figure growing clearer, but his face remained shrouded in darkness. I'm the one you've been running from, Sarah. The one you've always known. His words hit me like a physical blow, knocking the breath out of me. I stumbled back, unable to process what he was saying. Why? I gasped. Why are you doing this? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he took another slow step forward, his shadow stretching out across the grass, swallowing the light from the street lamps. Because, he said softly, you opened it. You found the diary, Sarah. And now you can never go back. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything to escape. But my body refused to move. His presence was suffocating, every inch of him felt like a weight on my chest. You opened the door to the past, he continued, his voice like ice, and now the future is written in ink that you can't erase. Before I could respond, the world around me seemed to distort. The park, the street, the night, everything warped like a dream on the edge of waking. The edges of my vision blurred, and the only thing I could focus on were his eyes. Those unblinking, empty eyes. You can't outrun this, he whispered. The last thing I remember was the sound of my own scream, swallowed by the darkness. When I opened my eyes again, I wasn't sure where I was. My vision was blurred, and my head felt like it was floating, detached from my body. My limbs were heavy, like they had been weighed down by some invisible force. I blinked rapidly, trying to clear the fog in my mind, but the world around me was still hazy, disorienting. I was lying on something soft, a couch or a bed, but it didn't feel like my own. The air was cold, a chill creeping through the fabric of my clothes, making me shiver involuntarily. I sat up slowly, my hand shaking as I wiped the fog from my eyes. Everything looked off. The colors were muted, as though someone had drained all the warmth from the room. I was in a small, dimly lit room, an apartment, perhaps. There were no windows, just a single light bulb overhead casting harsh shadows across the walls. The space felt too small, too confined. Where was I? I glanced around, looking for any clue as to how I got here. But there was nothing. No phone, no bag, no trace of anything familiar. Then, my eyes fell on a small wooden desk in the corner of the room. On top of it was the diary, the one I had left at home, the one that had caused all of this. The one that had been telling the future. It lay there, perfectly still. But the pages had changed again. I walked toward it slowly, my feet dragging as though I were walking through molasses. The room felt unreal, like I was walking in a dream. Every step seemed to take forever, and the air was thick, almost suffocating. But I had to know. I had to understand what was happening. I reached the desk, picking up the diary with trembling hands. As I flipped it open, I saw the new entry, written in the same familiar, childish handwriting. Sarah will wake up soon. She will be confused. She will be alone. I froze. My pulse quickened, and my skin prickled with an icy sweat. I hadn't written this. There was no way. But it was there, staring back at me in black ink. She will see the man again, and he will not let her go. I gasped, stumbling backward, the diary slipping from my hands and falling to the floor with a soft thud. The words in the diary were no longer just eerie predictions, they were a map of what had happened and what was still to come. and they were getting closer. Suddenly, the door to the room creaked open. I spun around, my breath caught in my throat. There, standing in the doorway, was the man. He was taller than I remembered, his frame long and thin, almost skeletal. His eyes were dark and empty, his face hidden in shadow. The coldness of his presence filled the room, suffocating every ounce of warmth. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The mere fact that he was standing there was enough to make my blood run cold. I wanted to scream, to run, to do something. But I couldn't move. It was as if my body had been paralyzed by the sight of him. He stepped forward, the floor creaking beneath his feet with each deliberate movement. I could feel the weight of his gaze on me, even though his eyes never left the ground. "You can't escape, Sarah." His voice was a low rasp, like gravel being ground together. "It's too late for that." I backed away, my legs trembling, but I couldn't seem to get away from him. His presence seemed to fill every corner of the room, pressing in on me, making it harder to breathe. The words from the diary echoed in my mind. "She will see the man again, and he will not let her go." I had to get out. I had to. Before I could finish the thought, he was right in front of me. His cold, bony hand shot out, gripping my wrist with an iron-tight hold. The force of his grip sent a jolt of pain through my body, but I couldn't tear myself away. It felt like he was pulling me into the darkness with him. "You opened the door to the past," he said, his voice low and almost amused. "Now you're trapped in it." I tried to jerk my arm free, but his grip only tightened. "What do you want from me?" I managed to choke out, my voice barely a whisper. "Why are you doing this?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he tilted his head, studying me with those empty eyes. I felt like I was looking into a void, a blackness that had no end. It was as if he were seeing something that I couldn't. "You shouldn't have opened it," he repeated, his voice more forceful now, like an accusation. "You should have left the past where it belonged." "What is this?" I demanded, my heart hammering in my chest. "What happened to me? Why can't I remember?" The man's expression softened for a split second, almost as if he were considering something. Then, his lips curled into a thin, almost cruel smile. "You will remember soon enough," he said. "Everything you've forgotten, everything you've erased, will come back. And then you'll understand. But by then, it will be too late." I shivered, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. My mind was racing. The fear was almost too much to bear. What was happening to me? Why couldn't I remember? Is this all because of the diary? I whispered. Did I write all of this? He didn't answer. Instead, his hand moved from my wrist to my throat, his fingers cold against my skin. My breath hitched, panic rising as his grip tightened ever so slightly. I struggled to breathe, my pulse pounding in my ears. "You won't be able to stop it," he said quietly, his breath cold against my face. "The diary has already chosen. You're already part of it." Suddenly, the room around me seemed to fade. The walls began to blur, the edges of reality melting like wax, and the light flickered as though it were about to go out. My vision was spinning, and the world felt more and more like a dream. I felt myself losing grip on what was real. The man's grip loosened, but his eyes never left mine. "You can't escape the past, Sarah," he said, his voice fading into the darkness. "It's already too late." And then everything went black. I woke up again, but this time I wasn't in the same room. I wasn't anywhere I recognized. The air was warm, almost suffocating, and the floor beneath me felt soft, too soft. I blinked rapidly, trying to make sense of what was happening. It took a moment for my eyes to adjust to the dim, flickering light above me. I could hear the faint hum of electricity somewhere in the distance, but there was no other sound. It was like I had been dropped into another world entirely, a place that felt foreign yet somehow familiar. The room was small, claustrophobic. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, yellowed with age. There was a single wooden chair in the corner, a few boxes piled up in the other. But it was the desk in front of me that drew my attention. The diary. I didn't know how it had gotten here, but it was sitting on that desk, open to the last page I had seen. The words still stood out to me, burned into my mind like a brand. You can't escape the past, Sarah. It's already too late. I didn't move at first. My hands were shaking, and my chest felt tight as though I were suffocating under an invisible weight. The memories, if they were memories, came flooding back, rushing like water through a broken dam. The man. His cold eyes. His voice, so empty, so full of malice. I could still feel his grip on my throat, could still hear his words echoing in my head. He had said it was too late. Too late for what? What had I done? I turned my head toward the desk, the small notebook calling to me as if it had a mind of its own. I stumbled toward it, my legs barely supporting me. I was so tired. So very tired. As my fingers brushed against the edges of the diary, something strange happened. The room seemed to shift, like the walls were closing in around me. The air grew thick, stifling. I could feel it pressing against my chest, making it harder to breathe. It was as though the very room was alive, aware of my every movement. I opened the diary again, and what I saw made my blood run cold. The last entry, the one I'd seen before, was still there. But beneath it was something new. Sarah will begin to remember what she has forgotten, but she will not understand it. She will try to escape, but she will fail. She will be trapped in the past forever. My hands trembled as I read the words. This was no ordinary diary. It was as if it had been written by someone or something who knew everything about me. Knew my thoughts, my actions, even my deepest fears. And it had been guiding me, leading me to this moment. I wanted to throw the book across the room, to tear it apart. But my hands wouldn't obey. They were drawn to the pages, compelled by something I couldn't explain. I turned the page. Another entry. She will find the old photograph. It will be the key, but she will not recognize it. It will make no sense. A photograph? My heart raced. I didn't know what this meant. I couldn't remember anything about a photograph. But something deep within me stirred, as if that word, that photograph, was important. I searched the room, my breath quickening. There had to be something. Anything. My eyes darted to the corners, to the boxes, to the walls. My pulse pounded in my ears, and I could feel a rising sense of panic clawing at my throat. I turned the desk over in a frenzy, not caring about the mess I was making, but books and papers scattering across the floor. I ripped through the piles of boxes, not knowing what I was looking for, but knowing I had to find it. And then, I saw it. Behind a small stack of papers, I found an old photograph. The edges were yellowed, and it looked worn, as if it had been handled 1,000 times. My hands shook as I picked it up, and I gasped when I saw what was in the photo. It was a picture of me, but it wasn't recent. It was from my childhood, from a time I couldn't remember. And in the background, barely visible, was the man, the one who had appeared in my dreams, the one who had haunted me with his empty eyes and cold voice. He was there, standing in the shadows, watching me. I stumbled backward, the photograph slipping from my fingers and falling to the floor with a soft thud. How could this be? How could he be in my past? How had I forgotten this? Suddenly, the air felt even heavier, suffocating. The room seemed to spin around me, the walls closing in. I looked around, desperate for an escape, but there was nowhere to go. The door was locked. The windows were sealed shut. I was trapped. The sound of footsteps echoed through the room, faint but growing louder with each passing second. I turned, my heart racing, and there he was, the man. His cold, emotionless face stared back at me, his eyes dark and hollow, like two endless pits. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His presence was enough to freeze me in place, to paralyze me with fear. You remember now, don't you? His voice was a soft whisper, but it felt like it was coming from all directions, filling the room, the space, my very soul. I tried to speak, but no words came out. My throat felt dry, constricted. The air around me grew thick, impossibly heavy. I was drowning in it. I remember everything, he continued, his voice growing louder. I remember how you tried to run, how you tried to forget. But you can't escape the past, Sarah. It will always find you. I backed away, but there was nowhere to go. His eyes followed me, tracking my every movement. The photograph I had found was still lying on the floor, mocking me. What do you want from me? I gasped, my voice barely a whisper. He didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something, a small, dark object that gleamed in the dim light. It was another diary. He held it out to me, his eyes never leaving mine. Take it, he said, his voice cold and final. It's the last entry you'll ever make. I didn't want to take it. I didn't want to. But something inside me, the same something that had guided me this far, compelled me to reach out, to take it from his hands. As soon as my fingers touched the cover, everything went dark. And then, nothing. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.